Chapter 558. Another blunder. I actually made the link to the Fist Aura into Evil Ming. Of course, both books were written by the same person. The book number has been corrected. It should be 1040013. I also don't understand why I would bring up Evil Ming's link. What a head-scratcher. Commander of the 13 City Gate Guards, Zhang Diqing, 3rd level. His personnel files were in the Bureau of Military Affairs. His manor was in the south of the city. His servants were chosen by the Overwatch Council. His salary was taken from the internal court. He had never gone to the Bureau of Military Affairs for a meeting. He hadn't even taken a step into the old military yamen. Nominally, he was a soldier. His relationship with the Qing military was like that of a widow and a father-in-law. Even if you beat him to death, he wouldn't dare get too close. His family, colleagues, and the people he socialized with were all people the Emperor allowed him to socialize with. The reason for this was because the Emperor always kept the keys to the 9 city gates on his belt. Thus, the Qing Emperor had to keep his head on his belt. If Zhang Diqing dared to rebel, the Emperor had many ways to make him die a tragic death. However, no one thought that Zhang Diqing would rebel. It wasn't just because his family had been loyal for generations. It wasn't just because even his wife was the descendant of generations of loyal officials. Over the years, people had become used to Zhang Diqing's way of doing things. He ate the Emperor's food and listened to the Emperor's words. Sir Zhang would not wish the Emperor wisdom when he ate. He would also not occasionally find an excuse to enter the palace to flatter the Emperor. However, he carried out any of the Emperor's edicts with unusual firmness, including that night many years ago when Jingdo bled with blood. Counting on one's fingers, Sir Zhang Diqing was like Dingzhou's Yizhong. They were both elders who had managed Jingdo for nearly 20 years. For such a person who was as clean as tofu and the sensitive position he managed, no power dared to come into contact with him. Even the second prince, who had once fought with the crown prince for power, did not dare. Coming into contact with Zhang Diqing was the same as touching his father's crotch. Thus, Zhang Diqing was like an invisible person in officialdom. Unless it was a critical moment like this, no one would think of him. After the Qing Emperor had died heroically on Dong Mountain, Sir Zhang Diqing's loyalty had quickly and accurately shifted to the Empress Dowager. His figure was revealed in an instant, and it was especially dazzling. He was loyal to the Empress Dowager, not because she was the Emperor's birth mother, but because the Emperor had announced to the world that the present Qing kingdom was being ruled by the Empress Dowager. These 2 young officials of the Overwatch Council could guess that the Emperor must have other ways to control Zhang Diqing. However, the Emperor had already passed, so they had no way to start. They could only proceed from the word of loyalty. Zhang, Fan Zhang Yen said. Yen Zhang Zhang Yen. Zhang Diqing was already old, and the bags under his eyes were a little thick. Perhaps it was because he had been worried these days and hadn't had a good rest. At this moment, the pupils above the eye bags were shining with sadness, anger, and many other emotions. In the yamen of the 13 city gate guards, Yen Bingyun arrived alone. After handing over the copy of the posthumous edict, he quietly waited for Zhang Diqing's choice. To be able to copy the Qing Emperor's posthumous edict in such a short amount of time proved that the Overwatch Council's skill level had taken a qualitative leap after successfully forging the old Ming master's will. It also proved that Fan, at this moment, was a revolutionary rebellious spirit that was not afraid of boiling water. It also proved that although Sir Yen Jr. was loyal to the monarch and loved his country, he was not mechanically bureaucratic in the details. The so-called posthumous edict was actually a letter the Emperor had written to the Empress Dowager in an indifferent tone that seemed to have seen through the affairs of the world the night Dong Mountain was surrounded. In the letter, he mentioned the matter of dethroning the Crown Prince, as well as the sinister roles the Crown Prince and eldest princess played in the siege of Dong Mountain. At the same time, he clearly stated that after Fan Xian returned to Jingdo, the power of regent would be given to him. Furthermore, to everyone's disbelief, he would be given the power to choose the next monarch of the Qing kingdom. 2 lines of tears flowed down from Zhang Diqing's eyes. Although he had long known that the emperor had died on Dong Mountain, seeing the emperor's handwriting, this third-level commander of the city gate guards still couldn't stop the emotions in his heart from surging. Has the Empress Dowager seen this posthumous edict? Zhang Diqing suddenly raised his head and stared into Yan Bingyun's eyes. Sir Yan Jr. was increasingly certain that the plan he and Fan Xian had come up with would succeed. No matter how one looked at it, this commander famed for his loyalty in court would stand on his side. He quietly said, "The Empress has already seen it." Then what about the fireworks and arrows in the palace earlier? Zhang Diqing stared at Yan Bingyun. The posthumous edict orders Sir Fan Jr. to assist the Empress Dowager in getting rid of the rebels. Yan Bingyun was not flustered. As long as Fan Xian's mission to break into the palace was successful and the crown prince and eldest princess were captured, there was no reason for the city gate guards to have any problems. The fireworks have already begun. I cannot rely on a posthumous edict to believe you, Zhang Diqing said. I want to see the Empress Dowager. Of course. Yan Bingyun's face was icy as he answered cleanly. He actually didn't know the situation in the palace. He didn't know whether the Empress Dowager was dead or alive. But he had to answer confidently. You have been loyal for generations. In this time of danger for the Qing kingdom, you must act according to the previous emperor's posthumous edict. Yan Bingyun did not forget to attach each word to the emperor's posthumous edict. Back in the day, he had traveled around northern Qi under an alias. He was skilled in using money and power. He was also a powerful figure who could deceive people without paying with his life. However, these years, he had only done some desk work in the council and had been away from such dangerous work for too long. Tonight, he had single-handedly convinced the Jingdo magistrate. Now, he had convinced the commanders of the 13 city gate guards amidst a forest of guns. It could only be considered that he had returned to his old profession. There is chaos in the palace, Zhang Diqing said after a moment of silence. I need to enter the palace immediately. Yan Bingyun furrowed his brows. Zhang Diqing's gaze focused as if he had sensed something. Yan Bingyun coldly reprimanded, Sir Zhang, don't forget that the emperor has entrusted these 9 city gates to you. It is your duty to firmly guard the gates for Jingdo. After these words were said, Zhang Diqing fell silent again. It was as if he was considering something. A moment later, he said, Sir Yan, give me some time. Delay? Yan Bingyun faintly sensed something strange. Had Zhang Diqing not been convinced by this posthumous edict and still wanted to see the situation in Jingdo? He didn't know that the eldest princess and crown prince had already escaped the palace. If the 13 city gate guards temporarily remained neutral, it was not a result he could not accept. In fact, it was even better than what he had anticipated. Since he had to delay, then he would delay. Yan Bingyun calmly sat down in the city gate yamen. He sat calmly with a calm expression. Seeing his expression, Zhang Diqing couldn't help but be startled. It was as if he had not expected him to be so confident. However, no one expected that it would drag on for such a long time. Yan Bingyun was under house arrest in the city gate yamen. There was no hot tea to drink or music to listen to. It was indeed difficult to endure. Of course, the most difficult thing was the omnipresent pressure. He drank the northwest wind and heard the occasional sound of killing in Jingdo. Sometimes he could even smell a faint burning smell. Someone had probably set something on fire. Zhang Diqing didn't have much time to sit with him. As the commander of the city gate guards, he had too many important things to take care of. He gripped the sword at his waist and walked in the darkness on the city walls. The blisters under his eyes had miraculously disappeared. A light like that of a hawk's flashed through his eyes as he stared at every movement in Jingdo. At the same time, he occasionally sent out orders to suppress his subordinates and strictly forbid them from participating in the coup in Jingdo. He only had 3,000 soldiers watch the 9 Jingdo city gates tightly. In his eyes, the so-called righteous power led by Fan Xian was actually a coup. Although, after reading the posthumous edict, he had to admit that Fan Xian had a righteous reputation, he still unconsciously thought that everyone who attacked the royal palace was a bad person. Compared to Shangjing in northern Qi, Qing Kingdom's Jingdo did not have as much history. However, it had more traces of the military. Although the city walls were not modeled, they were very thick. Although they were not as tall as the royal palace, if they were truly used for defense, the various configurations were much more powerful. Zhang Diqing stood on the city walls. It was as if he was drawing endless power from the thick stone and brick walls, giving him the courage to make certain choices. At a lookout, he stopped and gazed into the distance in the direction of the royal palace. The chaos in Jingdo gradually calmed. It seemed that the Jingdo government had already been subdued by Fan Xian. Bailiffs began to go out into the streets and sound gongs to calm the people. He did not know that the two masterminds of the Jingdo Palace rebellion, the Great Prince and Fan Xian, were also standing on the city walls and gazing into the distance in the direction of the city gate. A faint worry flashed through his eyes. If things continued to develop like this, he could only accept the posthumous edict. Perhaps this was not a bad choice. However, Zhang Diqing heard the sound of carriage wheels grinding against the stone road. The sound rang out clearly in his ears. It's the triangular stone road. It's near the city gate. Zhang Diqing was unusually familiar with the area around the city gates. He had managed for nearly 20 years. He was so familiar that he could even tell whether the carriage wheels were grinding over the stone road or the triangular stone road. He was silent for a moment. He then walked down the tall city walls and into the yamen of the city gate department. When the sound of the carriage rang out outside the city gates, Yan Bingyun had already stood up with a heavy expression. The soldiers around him responsible for guarding him became nervous. Pulling out their weapons, they surrounded him in the middle. Yan Bingyun's heart sank, not because he was surrounded by soldiers, but because of the sound of the carriage. In the middle of the night in Jingdo, who would ride a carriage near the city gates? The people of Jingdo had long experienced the court's overthrow. A commotion like the one tonight would not scare them enough to flee. Furthermore, the people were not stupid enough to sit in a carriage and wait to be tortured by the red-eyed soldiers. There was only one kind of person who wanted to leave the capital in a carriage. Zhang Diqing walked in. Looking at Yan Bingyun with a heavy expression, he said, "Excuse me, Sir Yan." He then shouted, "Take down this court criminal." Yan Bingyun's pupils constricted slightly. He didn't know why Zhang Diqing's attitude had changed so drastically. Had Zhang Diqing's mission to break into the palace failed? The soldiers surrounded him. Yan Bingyun did not resist. Everyone knew that the biggest difference between Sir Yan Jr. and Sir Fan Jr. was that his martial prowess was on the lower side. When he attacked, he did not have much killing power. Yan Bingyun would not risk his life. Zhang Diqing only wanted to take him down. If he resisted and these dozen long spears pierced into his body, it would not feel good. The city gate department did not have the Overwatch Council's steel finger glove. Instead, they had a small shackle. After it locked onto a person's wrist, it was impossible to struggle free. After Yan Bingyun was tightly bound, Zhang Diqing let out a breath and looked with confusion at the dark night outside. Who would have thought that you would actually come alone? Zhang Diqing's brows were furrowed tightly. I don't know whether to say that Sir Fan Jr. is stupid or that you are too daring. Yan Bingyun was kicked to the ground and made a rare joke. Actually, this is just a problem of manpower. He paused and then said, I cannot imagine that I would misjudge a person. Zhang Diqing was silent for a moment and then said, The reason is simple. If you win, I will follow the edict. If you lose, what benefit is there for me to follow the edict? Yan Bingyun furrowed his brows and sighed a moment later. A loyal official, loyal official. How loyal? I am loyal to the emperor, but I will not be loyal to this posthumous edict whose authenticity is unknown. Zhang Diqing's expression was slightly ugly. It was as if he felt a glimmer of fear that he had disobeyed the emperor's posthumous edict. The commander of the city gate department thought to himself that if the emperor was still here, he would be a loyal official for a lifetime. However, the emperor was no longer here. Who would want to guard these 9 broken city gates for a lifetime? Yan Bingyun was silent. He had come to the city gate department to take a risk, but it was also based on his judgment of Zhang Diqing. He still could not convince himself why such a commander would so cleanly choose to stand against the posthumous edict. Had Fan Xian lost? Yan Bingyun's brows were still furrowed as if he was thinking of a difficult problem. At this moment, Zhang Diqing was only 3 steps away from him. Yan Bingyun's brows suddenly relaxed. A drop of cold sweat slid down from the corner of his brows. However, Zhang Diqing clearly heard a cracking sound, as if a table leg had been forcibly broken by someone. Yan Bingyun suddenly raised his head and said each word clearly. Commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Diqing, has disobeyed the edict and aided in the chaos. All Qing citizens should be punished according to the emperor's posthumous edict. Zhang Diqing's gaze moved slightly. He didn't know who Yan Bingyun's words were meant for. At this moment, the people in the hall were all his trusted aides. No one would be stupid enough to attack. However, he felt a glimmer of strangeness in his heart. Unconsciously, he retreated, wanting to put some distance between him and the tightly bound Yan Bingyun. Someone moved. The person who moved was not Yan Bingyun. Rather, it was one of Zhang Diqing's trusted soldiers. After that person heard Yan Bingyun's words, his face darkened. Gritting his teeth, he raised the knife in his hand and brought it down toward the back of Zhang Diqing's head. Just as was said earlier, no matter how much the Qing emperor trusted Zhang Diqing's loyalty, he would always have spies in the city gate department. Most of these spies were sent out by the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian and Yan Bingyun could not come into contact with these spies, but Yan Bingyun was using the posthumous edict to gamble on the hot blood of these spies. Even if it was 1 in 10, it would still be very effective. The wind of the knife came down. Zhang Diqing's face darkened. Without turning his head, he raised his sword and swung it. With a crisp sound, he was forced to take a step forward. The knife of the Overwatch Council secret agent behind him was also blocked. The long spear stabbed forward. In an instant, the secret agent's body was covered in fresh blood and died. Yan Bingyun also moved at this moment. When the drop of cold sweat dripped from his forehead, he had already moved. He gritted his teeth and forcefully snapped his left wrist in the middle. He was not a normal official or general. He was the successor commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Since he dared to come personally to the city gate department, he had confidence. The Overwatch Council had studied the tools of the city gate guards very thoroughly. In the end, they had finally discovered the problem with this flail. As long as someone was able to separate the entire wrist joint in a short amount of time and endure the splitting pain, they could pull the wrist out. Yan Bingyun was able to endure the pain and was willing to be ruthless to himself. When Zhang Diqing took a step closer to him, he had already charged up like a cheetah. With the flail in one hand, he viciously smashed it toward Zhang Diqing's head. A glimmer of fear flashed through Zhang Diqing's eyes. Perhaps betraying the emperor had made his state of mind unsteady. He did not dare to take this blow head-on and retreated in a panic. At this moment, the soldiers behind him had stabbed the Overwatch Council secret agent to death and just happened to block his path of retreat. He could only rush wretchedly toward the door of the hall in an attempt to temporarily avoid this attack. Yan Bingyun floated up and gave chase like a cloud. Along the way, He flipped his wrist and snatched the sword from Zhang Diqing's hand. With a flash of green light, he chopped off the arm of an officer who had come to help. Like a maggot on a bone and a greedy cloud, Yan Bingyun did not fall a single step. He stuck close to Zhang Diqing's body and arrived at the door of the hall. Feeling the dense sword qi behind him, Zhang Diqing was frightened. He had not expected Yan Bingyun to have such delicate and ruthless sword skills. Yan Bingyun was not good at martial arts, but that was when compared to the freak Fan Xian. Once he exploded to kill, how could the most famous spy in the history of the Overwatch Council, Zhang Diqing, who had guarded the city gate for 20 years, stand up to him? The lightning-fast pursuit did not give the soldiers of the city gate guards any chance to react. The two of them had already reached the door of the hall. Bloody wounds appeared on Yan Bingyun's body. If Yan Bingyun had not tried to restrain him to control the city gate guards, he would probably have long lost his life. Suddenly, two rays of sharp qi shot toward Yan Bingyun's body. They were extremely powerful and abrupt. Yan Bingyun gave a muffled grunt and pulled back his sword to protect his chest. Blood seeped out of his nose and mouth. However, the sharp attack finally stopped. Zhang Diqing wretchedly rolled to a stop at someone's feet. It was possible to see the light-colored palace dress hidden under ordinary clothing. The calm eldest princess, Li Yunrui, smiled slightly at Yan Bingyun and said, "Under the protection of two aces of the Juanshang Conference, let me tell Sir Yan Jr. that the reason Diqing betrayed us is because he was originally one of us." A glimmer of disbelief and shock flashed through Yan Bingyun's eyes. Shortly after, it turned to dejection. His left hand had been crippled. Standing in the hall of the city gate guards in front of the pool of blood of that brave secret agent, he appeared very lonely. Chapter 559. At the end of last month, Baoyu's father's father said that it was okay not to read the book reviews. I deeply agree with him. Recently, I haven't read much, so I haven't added much. Please understand. The reason I haven't read it is because I have always been the kind of trash most easily affected by emotions. I can tolerate criticism and accept criticism, but that doesn't mean I like criticism, especially the glorious, correct, and great kind. Today, I drank some wine and couldn't resist reading it. Many negative emotions rose to the corners of my lips like a treacherous official's smile. I was unable to be happy. Writing a novel is making up a story. Once I explain it, it will become too boring. I can't say it. You will understand later. Regardless of whether I like it or not, I have to write it like this. In this world, there is no work that everyone likes to see. After all, I am not the director of the Spring Festival Gala, and I do not plan on participating in the 5 ones. I understand that everyone likes this story, which is why they are discussing and criticizing it so seriously. However, I also hope that everyone can understand the irritation and unease of a person's body often staying at home and the mind often exploding. What I need the most right now is not advice or criticism, but the pleasure brought by praise or a calm space to write. These were some explanatory words, shamelessly asking for applause. One of Yan Bingyun's hands was broken and hung weakly by his waist. He looked at the eldest princess. His gaze appeared dim. The dull pain in his chest let him know that he had already suffered internal injuries from the touch earlier. The aces of the Juanshang Conference beside the eldest princess were not people he could stand against. At this moment, the 13 city gate guards had already been heavily surrounded by soldiers. The long spears were pointed at Xiaoyan. 2 of the Juanshang Conference aces beside the eldest princess separated and quickly closed in on Yan Bingyun. The sharp blades in their hands gave off a deathly stillness that enveloped his entire body. If only the emperor had listened to Enji back then and cleaned out the Juanshang Conference. Before his death, Yan Bingyun couldn't help but think of this. He knew he was no match for these Jianghu aces, so he didn't extravagantly beg the Temple of Heaven to give him a chance to escape. He only pulled out something from his clothes with a heavy expression. Since there was a change in the city gate department, he had to report Zhang Diqing's fatal betrayal to Fan Xian in the royal palace before he died. Yan Bingyun's index finger grabbed the ring of the arrow. Looking at the two black sword shadows that were getting closer and closer, his pupils shrank. He spat out a mouthful of turbid air, tightly pursed his lips, and forcefully pulled. With a hiss, the command arrow ignited, but it didn't rise into the air because a small force had struck his wrist. A wisp of warm liquid splashed onto the back of his hand, causing his heart to tremble. This command arrow flew out diagonally. It didn't fly very far before it shot into the chest of a city gate department soldier and exploded with a pop. Yan Bingyun didn't lower his head. From the corner of his eyes, he could see that his hand was covered in blood. When his index finger reached into the ring, fear appeared in the eyes of the Juanshan conference ace closest to him. It was as if he had seen something unusually terrifying. Then, a thin line of blood appeared on the ace's neck. The line of blood spread out in an instant and became a bloody gash. One could see the ace's ghastly white throat bone, unusually disgusting trachea, esophagus, and blurry flesh. With a crack, the ace charged in front of Yan Bingyun and knelt down with a thud. Jolted by the force of the attack, his throat, which had been sliced open, was powerless to hold onto his head. With the vertebrae at the back of his neck as the center, his head flipped weakly to his back. The upside-down, pale, dead face stared with wide eyes at the eldest princess and Zhang Diqing, who were protected by layers of aces and soldiers. Fresh blood sprayed out of his throat like a fountain and struck Yan Bingyun's hand, painting his entire hand a bright red. Coincidentally, it also prevented the arrow of command from rising into the sky. The other Juanshan conference ace, who had charged over, faced an even more wretched fate. He didn't charge in front of Yan Bingyun at all. His gaze only caught a faint shadow reflected by the torch passing in front of him. He felt a coldness at his throat. A delicate and lusterless sword stabbed out from behind him on the right. With unusual stability and ruthlessness, it pierced through his neck at high speed and came out from the other side. With a hiss, the tip of the sword extended and then retracted like a viper's tongue. Like lightning, it left his neck. The expert's Zhenqi and life force also left his body along with the sword that had left his neck. His eyes were wide open like a dead fish, and he tried to cover his neck with one hand, but he found that he could no longer control any of the muscles in his body. His legs began to soften, his eyes began to darken, and he began to lose control of his bowels. He fell down and rolled on the ground like a gourd. He rolled past Yan Bingyun's frozen body and touched the high threshold of the city gate office before stopping. He was full of vigor, and a foul stench emanated from his body. In a flash, a sword that seemed to have stretched out from hell used a terrifying method to finish off two Juanshan conference aces. No one could react to what had happened. Even Yan Bingyun, whose life had been saved, couldn't react. He stood in shock where he was. Then, he felt his entire body lighten. In the next moment, he had been lifted by the neck by a black shadow and flown to the top of the city gate office. Following the shadows of the tall city walls, it moved toward the darkness of Jingdo. The darkness before dawn grew thicker and thicker. On the other hand, in the eyes of those people that intended to besiege and kill Yan Bingyun, they instead saw an even more terrifying scene. A black shadow seemed to have silently appeared within the crowd, and it easily and extremely swiftly killed two experts. It carried Yan Bingyun as if it was carrying a tattered sack, and it easily escaped from the encirclement of so many people. Because it was easy, it was terrifying. With 3 bangs, Yan Bingyun had already been rescued by this person. The soldiers of the city gate office didn't even have time to raise the bows in their hands. Who was this black shadow to have such terrifying power? Protected by the aces and soldiers at the very back, the eldest princess's face was slightly pale. She waved her hand to disperse the subordinates in front of her and walked out of the crowd. Looking in the direction the black shadow had escaped, she didn't know how she felt. Only her eyes grew brighter and brighter. The Overwatch Council is indeed very terrifying, thought the mastermind of the Jingdo Rebellion. The mastermind of the Jingdo Rebellion thought to himself. However, he did not feel too defeated. Since the person who had come today was the best assassin in the world, given his reputation for being the best at killing people, she had no way of stopping him from using this ability to save Yan Bingyun. However, it shouldn't affect anything. Li Yunrui thought of this as she narrowed her eyes and looked at the soldiers at the city gate. At this time, the sky was gradually brightening. The sun below the horizon began to release countless little silver fish, allowing their bulging bellies to reflect their own light. Gradually, they chased away the thick darkness of Jingdo. The torches were no longer as bright. The warm morning light fell on everyone's bodies and cast shadows on the ground. Of course, the Overwatch Council was terrifying. The 8 bureaus had hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Who knew how many heroes were willing to cover their faces, give up their former glory, and throw themselves into the great work of the Qin Kingdom's secret agents? When this power was twisted together, the power that could be unleashed was something that even the Qin Kingdom's most powerful emperor was secretly wary of. In name, the Overwatch Council was a secret agency directly managed by the Qin Emperor. However, everyone knew that the reason the Overwatch Council was able to attract the service of so many aces and survive so powerfully in the Qin Kingdom for over 30 years was all because of the old cripple in the wheelchair. Presently, there were only 1,000 Overwatch Council officials in Jingdo, yet they were already so terrifying. They had broken into the royal palace, suppressed the Ministry of Justice, forcefully opened the celestial prison, and subdued the Jingdo government. In one night, they had flipped the entire Jingdo upside down. Fan Xian's plan was good, and Yan Bingyun's execution was good. To be able to achieve such an effect, it still relied on the Overwatch Council officials' powerful organizational abilities and iron-blooded obedience. These unique qualities of the Overwatch Council were all forged, bit by bit, into the soul of the Overwatch Council by Chen Pingping, the old cripple, and the first generation of the heads of the 8 bureaus over decades. Thus, the most powerful person in the Overwatch Council was not the Black Knights, Fan Xian, or the best assassin in the world. Rather, it was Chen Pingping and what he represented. Strangely, the Crown Prince and eldest princess had planned the assassination of the Emperor at Dong Mountain. The eldest princess also knew the power of the Overwatch Council, but it seemed that she had put too little attention on the Overwatch Council. At least, in the eyes of the uneasy Crown Prince, if he was going to ascend to the throne, if he didn't first control Chen Pingping, who would sit on that throne? Fortunately, Chen Pingping had been poisoned and was isolated outside of Jingdo. The Crown Prince had thought that this was all his aunt's doing. No one knew that this matter had nothing to do with Li Yunrui. From the beginning, Li Yunrui had never thought about dealing with the Chen garden outside Jingdo and the old man in the wheelchair. It wasn't because she didn't value Chen Pingping or because she thought Chen Pingping was an old strange creature that could never be destroyed. It was because she had a secret. The secret was only one person's secret. The rest of the people in the plan did not know. After the news of Chen Pingping being poisoned by the Dongi Master reached Jingdo, everyone's heart jumped. They thought the old cripple was pretending to be something. When the news of the assassination of the Emperor at Dong Mountain came, the Empress Dowager ordered Chen Pingping to immediately enter the palace, but Chen Pingping remained in Chen Garden. Everyone began to guess something. Had Chen Pingping truly been poisoned? Therefore, there was an old man who had known Chen Pingping for decades, who was tempted and had a thought. This old man had always had a secret fear of Chen Pingping. If he didn't kill him, he would not feel at ease. Furthermore, the present situation was not good. As the saying goes, take his life when he is ill. If he didn't take advantage of this time to take Chen Pingping's life, the old man would feel sorry for himself. After the old Qin master, who grew cabbages, left Jingdo to take control of the army, and his son took back the power of the Jingdo garrison. The first order he gave was to slaughter Chun Garden. Chun Garden had become a wasteland. In Fan Xian's eyes, Chun Garden, which was even more luxurious than the Jiangnan Ming family's garden, had become countless black and gray ruins. Those beautiful and elegant gardens had already been burnt to black soil. Those exquisite and grand houses had already been reduced to innumerable halves of stone walls. Green smoke was still rising from everywhere, but it no longer had that scorching heat, and looked abnormally desolate. If Fan Xian saw this scene, his heart would probably ache to death, and he would loudly curse those people who didn't know how to treasure. From ancient times until now, the military had been an existence that had least need for artistic beauty. Thus, when a branch of the Qin family's army charged into Chun Garden with lightning speed, it was only natural that they set a fire. The reason for this fire was not similar to the fire of the Eight-Nation Coalition Army. The bandits of the Eight-Nation Coalition Army thought there were too many things and couldn't move them away, so they simply burned it and didn't leave it for the people. The reason the Qin family's army set a fire was because they hadn't stolen anything or captured anyone. The traps outside Chun Garden that had once terrified Fan Xian still existed. The Qin family's army had only broken into Chun Garden after over 300 people had died. However, they didn't find a single living person in Chun Garden. What welcomed them was an empty garden. Director Chun, who was rumored to be poisoned and bedridden, was not in the garden. His beautiful serving girls were also not in the garden. The servants were not in the garden. Everyone seemed to have left a long time ago. They had left unusually cleanly. Even the paintings hanging on the walls of Chun Garden had been taken down. Chun Pingping liked those paintings. This army controlled by the Qin family was mainly made up of the Jingdo garrison. The leader was a general of the second generation of the Qin family. He was Qin Heng's cousin. He looked at the empty Chun Garden in exasperation, thinking of how he had led the army to attack and had died so many people only to occupy an empty garden. He couldn't help but want to vomit blood. In his anger, this Qin general had set a fire. In the raging flames, he ordered a fast horse to report back to the Yuantai camp. He didn't dare lead the army back, because the old Qin master had given a death order. Since he had moved against Chun Garden, he had to kill Chun Pingping before he could return to the army. Helpless, he could only wipe away his usual pride and respectfully ask the black-clothed man beside him for advice. This black-clothed man had been sent by the old man to help him. On the way the army had attacked, he had said that Chun Garden would be empty at this time. At the time, this Qin general still didn't believe it. Now, he had no choice but to believe it. He sighed in his heart. After all, he was an elder of the Overwatch Council. He knew Chun Pingping's power and calculations much better. The masked Yen Ruahai rode beside General Qin and said, "Since the director has left, then you should be mentally prepared. Don't think about catching him in a short amount of time." General Qin paused. Yen Ruahai glanced at him and mockingly said, "Don't forget, he is Chun Pingping." After saying this, he pulled the horse's head and rode out of Chun Garden. He could not bear to look at the raging fire in Chun Garden behind him. He thought to himself, "I wonder how this general who set fire to Chun Garden will be cut into pieces by the headmaster in the future." He was a member of the Qin family. This secret seemed to only be known by the Qin family. The crown prince and eldest princess did not know. However, he was a member of the Overwatch Council. This secret was truly only known by the Overwatch Council. Of course, the Qin family did not know. Jingdo gradually became a city of danger. Memorials from various roads and counties entered the capital, but no edict came out of Jingdo. Fortunately, in this day and age, the exchange of information was inconvenient. Everyone was used to a slow pace. Even if the provinces around Jingdo felt it was strange, They did not panic because of Jingdo's dangerous situation. At least, for the next few days, the entire Qin kingdom, other than Jingdo and Dongshan Road, was peaceful as usual. The morning in Weizhou was no different from the morning in Jingdo. The director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping, who should have been in Jingdo dealing with the matter of the throne or treating poison in Qin Garden, raised his eyes to glance at the light in the sky above the courtyard. He furrowed his brows and began to raise his chopsticks to eat porridge and buns. Usually, in Qin Garden, the old man also liked to eat these two things. When the Empress Dowager's edict reached Qin Garden, this old ancestor of the Qing Secret Service immediately ordered his servants to prepare a carriage and pack his luggage. He did not return to the capital. Instead, he slipped away with unusual speed. Fan Xian and the Great Prince stood on the palace walls with worried faces, thinking about running away. Unexpectedly, the elder closest to them did this much more cleanly and efficiently than them. After a group of carriages left Qin Garden, they circled around the countryside to the south of Jingdo. The Qin family's army behind the carriages continued to persevere in searching for the whereabouts of the carriages, intending to kill them in one fell swoop. However, Chen Pingping was not in a hurry. The carriages did not increase their speed. They didn't even purposely hide their tracks. They only lured the army to circle behind them. The carriages circled 3 times to the south of Jingdo. The army also circled 3 times. The reason they never ran into them, other than the Overwatch Council's powerful intelligence network among the people outside the capital and their ability to hide their tracks, was because the army had an excellent guide. Yan Ruohai led the Qin family to chase after Chen Pingping. Even if one thought with their buttocks, one would know that as long as Chen Pingping was not willing, then they would never catch up. The fleeing carriages, which seemed to be on a tour, finally stopped in a manor outside Weizhou, the largest province to the south of Jingdo. Chen Pingping estimated that it was about time. Chen Pingping was eating porridge. His teeth were fine and he was not leaning against the wall. However, the Overwatch Council elders sitting beside him looked at the director's gaze and felt that he was somewhat shameless. Jingdo is in such a mess and your 2 nephews are risking their lives. How could you have the heart to run away by yourself? There were 3 people sitting around Chen Pingping's breakfast table. One was an old servant who had served him for decades in Qin Garden. The other was the previous head of the 7th Bureau, the Baldi, whom Fan Xian had once seen in the Overwatch Council's celestial prison. The other was one of the wings of the Overwatch Council, who was as famous as Wang Qinian, Zhong Zhui. From the back of the manor came the faint sounds of young concubines washing up and joking after waking up. These women did not know that they were fleeing. The expressions of the 3 Overwatch Council elders were not very good. Zhong Zhui pressed his lips together and moistened his nervous and parched lips. The pursuers are close. Director, we should make some plans. They are about to move their troops back. This matter is not urgent. Chen Pingping put down his chopsticks and wiped his mouth neatly. Go out and make arrangements. Yes. Zhong Zhui and the bald head of the 7th Bureau accepted their orders and left. Only Chen Pingping and the old servant were left in the courtyard. Suddenly, Chen Pingping began to cough uncomfortably. The old man's face became blood-red and then quickly became a deathly white. A trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his lips. The old servant cried and said, Master, we have to call Sir Fei back. Otherwise, what will we do with the poison? Chen Pingping had actually been poisoned. He sat in the wheelchair and smiled self-mockingly. The poison won't kill him. It's just a bit uncomfortable. Master, the capital is dangerous. Are you really not worried about Sir Fan Jr.? The old servant glanced at Chen Pingping and asked carefully. The wrinkles on Chen Pingping's old face suddenly increased. A moment later, he sighed and said, How can I not be worried? However, even if the matter fails, presumably he will still be alive. As long as he is alive, everything is fine. The old servant thought to himself that this matter involved the fight for the throne. If Sir Fan Jr. was truly defeated, how could he survive? Furthermore, if the Crown Prince truly inherited the throne, his group of carriages would probably not be able to find a place to stay in this vast Qin kingdom. The old servant suddenly thought of something and was overjoyed. Yes, there is still Minister Fan and King Jing who have not acted. These days, Chen Pingping had often discussed the situation in Jingdo with his old subordinate. The old servant had been listening to them from the side. He had a very clear understanding of the comparison of power in Jingdo. If the 13 city gate guards truly failed and the Yi and Qin families' armies entered the capital, how could the Overwatch Council stop them? Unless Fan Jian and King Jing had the power to flip the heavens in their hands, Director Chen would not be able to sit peacefully in his wheelchair and not worry for Fan Xian. King Jing and Old Qin are the same. They only vent their anger at the ground, Chen Pingping said with slight mockery. In Fan Jian's life, he wins by enduring silently, but he also loses by enduring silently. Where does he have enough power to change the situation? He is afraid that the palace will suspect him. All these years, Minister Fan has endured silently. Now, he has also endured silently. After saying this, Chen Pingping fell silent. He knew where Fan Jian's greatest strength was, but the problem was that His Majesty had taken all those people with him when he went to worship the heavens. He still didn't know if any of them would survive. A few white pigeons flew into the courtyard following the direction of the morning light. The old servant went forward to catch one and brought it in front of Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping untied the thin tube on the pigeon's leg and looked at the words on it. His brows gradually furrowed. A moment later, he summoned an Overwatch Council subordinate and ordered in a heavy voice, "Follow the order from a few days ago. Everyone move. Continue to seal off any news from Dongshan Road. The court's group heading to receive the spirit is almost here." Yes. After a long time, Chen Pingping finally woke up from his dazed state. It was not until now that this most powerful schemer in the Qin kingdom finally felt a glimmer of powerlessness. Perhaps it was the power of the poison or perhaps it was the power of old age, but it made him feel a glimmer of fatigue and faint disappointment. Fan Xian won't die so easily. Chen Pingping didn't know if he was comforting the old servant or himself. Calmly, he said, "At least I've helped this kid attract 6,000 soldiers. The pressure on him will lessen a great deal. You have to know that it is not an easy matter to make someone die." Chen Pingping pushed the wheelchair toward the back of the courtyard. The old servant quickly pushed it. As they passed by a flower bed, Chen Pingping's expression did not change as he looked at a small white flower shivering in the early autumn. He stopped and looked at it for a long time. Then, he slowly bent down and plucked a flower. Carefully, he placed it on his ear. The old servant smiled and pushed him into a side room in the back of the courtyard. When he entered the side room, Chen Pingping suddenly said to him, "If Fan Xian knew he was a father, he would certainly learn to value his life even more." The light in the side room was not very bright, but he could clearly see a woman around 20 years old looking at the baby in her arms with a face full of tenderness. This woman, whose face glowed with motherly love, was Cece, who had disappeared in the Fan Manor on the outskirts of Jingdo. The baby in her arms. Chen Pingping pushed the wheelchair forward and took the newborn baby from her hands with a face full of tenderness. Looking at the blush on the baby's face and tightly closed eyes, he flicked his tongue and cooed a few times. Teasingly, he said, "Little girl is very good. When your father sees you, he will definitely like you very much." Cece smiled sweetly as she watched this scene. Suddenly, she saw the little white flower on the corner of Chen Pingping's forehead and asked curiously, "Director, why is there a flower?" "Last time, when I held this child," she cried. "It looks like I'm too ugly. Today, there's another flower. Look, she's indeed not crying." The wrinkles on Chen Pingping's face turned into a chrysanthemum. That kind of tenderness could not be fake. He probably really liked the little girl in his arms, as if she was his own granddaughter. Having just given birth, Cece's strength was not very good. Gazing at Chen Pingping, she suddenly said with sadness, however, "I don't know when the young master will come back." When Chen Pingping took her away, Cece was also shocked. When she gave birth, Wan and the people she was familiar with in the Fan Manor were not by her side. There was only the midwife that Chen Pingping had arranged. This girl's state of mind had been greatly tormented. However, she knew Director Chen did not have any ill intentions. She just didn't understand why she had to give birth outside the manor. She couldn't help but think of the secrets of some large family. Her mood had always been low. "In a few days, Fan Xian will be back." Chen Pingping smiled and comforted her. "The most important thing for a pregnant woman is to be happy. That's why he asked me to take you out for a walk." This reason was clearly a bit far-fetched, but Cece's mind was clearly not very good after giving birth. She actually believed it. "You rest first." Chen Pingping was so happy that he refused to let go of the little baby girl for a moment. He said to Cece, "I'm going to take the child out for a walk." Cece said, "You can't let the wind blow." Chen Pingping nodded obediently. In front of a mother, he had to be more obedient to steal her child to play with. Chen Pingping played with the baby girl all the way to another room. He said to the person in the room, "Let me show you, Fan Xian's daughter." The person was tied up tightly. His expression was uneasy and sad. Hearing these words, he suddenly became happy and said, "Director, has the young mistress given her a name?" He suddenly saw the little white flower by Chen Pingping's hair and said with a thought, "Let's call her Fan Xiaohua. Sir will definitely like it." The person who gave the name was Fan Xian's trusted aide, Wang Qinian. No one knew how this person had escaped from Dong Mountain or why he had been tied up in Chen Pingping's room. Chen Pingping glared at him and said, "What dog sh*t?" Wang Qinian had clearly lost a lot of weight. It looked like after escaping from Dong Mountain, he had suffered a lot on the way. He looked at the little baby girl in the director's arms. Amidst his joy, he suddenly thought of his family's daughter in the capital and Fan Xian, who was in the eye of the storm. For some reason, his nose became sore. "I wonder if Sir will be able to see his own daughter." With a mournful expression, he said, "What exactly is going on? I don't understand." Chen Pingping's expression was calm. "I also don't understand what will happen in Jingdou, but I know something will certainly happen in Jingdou." Fan Xian stood on the walls of the royal palace and looked at the rising sun in the east. His brows gradually furrowed together and he sighed. Up until now, he still had not found Wan and de Bao's whereabouts. Fortunately, King Jing's manor had sent word that his father and Lady Lu were both safe and well. They were heading in the direction of the royal palace. Counting on his fingers, Cece's due date had also arrived. He didn't know if the girl who had mysteriously disappeared was well or if the child was a boy or a girl. Of all his family, the one he was least worried about was Cece, who was about to give birth. Since the manor had tacitly approved of this matter, the person who had taken Cece could not be anyone else. It had to be the lonely old cripple in Chen Garden. What he was worried about was Yan Bingyun. After Yan Bingyun entered the city gate department, there had been no news. There was also no sign of the Overwatch Council person responsible for reporting information. All of this indicated that something had gone wrong. Fan Xian notified the Great Prince to begin making arrangements. He was only confused as to why Yan Bingyun had not sent out a signal. The morning sun leaped over the horizon. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. It was as if he felt that something beautiful was happening in the world. Chapter 560. Yuan Hongdao struggled to wake up. There was a sharp pain at the back of his head. He didn't know what environment he was in. His long life of hiding among enemy factions had made him used to constant silence. Like Wang Qinian, this Overwatch Council official actually had countless questions in his heart. Half a year ago, when the Emperor first took action against the eldest princess, although Yuan Hongdao didn't know the reason the Overwatch Council was able to sweep clean the eldest princess' apparent power within an hour was because they relied on this so-called top strategist in Xinjiang. What had puzzled Yuan Hongdao for the past half-year was that, after that operation, he should have left his life as a spy. According to the rules of the council, he should have chosen a place with beautiful mountains and clear waters to retire with honor. However, after escaping from the courtyard, Yan Ruohai had told him to return to Xinjiang. Return to Xinjiang. The eldest princess Xinjiang strategist had luckily escaped the Overwatch Council's pursuit. Logically speaking, he should be returning to Xinjiang. However, Yuan Hongdao sensed something else from the Overwatch Council's order. If after that night of thunder and rain, the eldest princess was destined to fall and be forever imprisoned, then why would Director Chen call him back to Xinjiang? What exactly was the court thinking? What was he going to do in Xinjiang? Yuan Hongdao had been thinking about this question for a few months. When the eldest princess easily passed on her plan to Xinjiang through the guards of the courtyard and gradually moved the people in Xinjiang to Jingdo, he finally understood some things. From the beginning of the Overwatch Council's operation, they knew that it was impossible for the eldest princess to be completely defeated. Perhaps the emperor had never planned for the eldest princess to never have the power to rise again. That was why he had him, a nail, returned to Xinjiang to wait for the eldest princess's summons and for that moment to come. The emperor had gone to Dong Mountain and been assassinated. Jingdo was in chaos. The crown prince was about to ascend to the throne. The eldest princess had contacted the military to prepare for rebellion. Even if the eldest princess did not let Yuan Hongdao know when she planned the Dong Mountain situation, Yuan Hongdao had personally participated in all of the subsequent events. He had already learned of the news at the beginning of the eldest princess's plan. It seemed that it was time for him to display his abilities as the top spy in the Qin kingdom. However, Yuan Hongdao was shocked to find that he was unable to pass on the information. He was unable to notify the Overwatch Council. All the channels were instantly disabled, and the bridge of one-way communication was mysteriously cut off. Yuan Hongdao was unable to contact Yan Ruohai, much less Chen Pingping. For a spy of his level, it was even more impossible for him to directly rush into the Overwatch Council and yell. His expression was calm, but his heart was terrified and uneasy. He didn't know exactly what had happened in the Overwatch Council. This kind of uneasy state continued until Fan Xian finally broke into the palace and began to use the martial power of his subordinates to sweep away the opposition in Jingdo. Yuan Hongdao had secretly cooperated with the Overwatch Council's actions and allowed the eldest princess' temporary royal courtyard to be taken. However, he knew that Fan Xian had already made a fatal mistake. Thus, in the last moment, he took the risk of calling out to the Overwatch Council official. He didn't trust anyone. In comparison, since he couldn't contact Chen Pingping and Yan Ruohai in the entire court, the only person he trusted the most was Chen Pingping's successor, Sir Fan Jr. Unfortunately, he didn't know what kind of a hothead Mu Feng was, so he was miserably knocked down with one punch. Yuan Hongdao calmed his breathing and opened his eyes. He discovered that he was in a corner tower above the imperial city, and in front of him was a handsome young man who was looking at him with a worried expression. Yuan Hongdao knew this person's identity. Although he didn't know why this person would personally interrogate him at such a tense moment, Yuan Hongdao directly said, "Zhang Fang belongs to the eldest princess." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything. The commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Fang, had the courtesy name Diqing. Everyone thought he was a righteous and loyal figure. Yet, he belonged to the eldest princess. This reality was enough to shock everyone. However, it was no longer able to add too much worry to his already helpless emotions. Yen Bingyun had not returned. The official responsible for keeping watch in the council had also not returned. There had to be something wrong with the city gate guards. Unfortunately, Yuan Hongdao had woken up too late. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. It was almost dawn. The Jingdo city gate guards had fallen. The Yi and Qin families' armies had entered the city at some point. At such a critical moment, he shouldn't have thought of Yuan Hongdao. However, looking at the officials resting in Taiji Palace, he, filled with helplessness, suddenly remembered the words his father-in-law had once said to him in Wuzhou. Other than Chen Pingping and Fan Jian, there were 3 people Lin Ruofu feared in court. Other than Chen Pingping and Fan Jian, it was the old Qin master who led the army. This powerful figure had told Fan Xian seriously that he would not give his trump card in court to Fan Xian in case the tree stood out in the forest and was blown down by the wild winds. Unless when the new emperor ascended the throne. Presently, the Qing emperor had already died. Fan Xian was in Jingdo helping the third prince steal the throne. Thus, the Lin civil officials in Jingdo tore off their disguises and stood behind Fan Xian, following the scholars Hu and Shu to stop the crown prince from ascending the throne. Fan Xian thought to himself that his father-in-law had been clever his whole life. His timing was very accurate. However, he didn't know if he would succeed this time. However, Prime Minister Lin's last words were remembered clearly by Fan Xian. If the capital truly becomes chaotic in the future, perhaps Yuan Hongdao can help you. A year ago, Lin Ruofu had calculated the Dong Mountain incident. Fan Xian admired his father-in-law's foresight to the point of prostrating himself on the ground, so he did not forget this move he had given him. When he sank into a dangerous situation he could not extricate himself from, he immediately thought of the top strategist in Xinyang under the eldest princess' command. Indeed, Sir Yuan was a spy the Overwatch Council had planted in Xinyang. This reality shocked Fan Xian and immediately made him vex. If he had known of the problem with the city gate guards earlier, he and the great prince would not have been so passive. In the end, it was still too late. In the end, this was still a matter of fate. He didn't know how much longer his good luck could last. Yuan Hongdao stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Why have I been unable to contact the council?" Although these words were calm, there was no lack of anger in them. There was none of Sir Yuan's usual ease. He had precious intelligence on the eldest princess' side in his hands, but he was unable to provide it to the Overwatch Council and court. His loyalty to the Qin kingdom and the emperor made Sir Yuan feel that something was very strange. Thus, he became angry. Fan Xian was silent and didn't know what to say. If possible, he wanted to personally ask Chen Pingping. The morning wind blew into the tall corner tower of the royal palace, causing the smell of blood from last night to gradually fade. The smell of burning in the private residences in Jingdo also disappeared. However, the pitiful commoners still did not dare to leave their homes. With great fear, they closed their doors and hid in their beds, praying that the killing game of these major figures would quickly end. Above the royal palace, the bugle horns rang out repeatedly. The sound was powerful and powerful. No one knew how far it could travel. Fan Xian stood by Yuan Hongdao's side. With a calm expression, he said, "The Jingdo garrison won't be able to enter the capital until noon. The Qin and Yi families still need another 3 days. If we move quickly, we can still take back the 9 city gates." A glimmer of shock flashed through Yuan Hongdao's eyes. Immediately after, a flame of anger burned in them. In a great rage, he said, "Is there no one in the garrison in the council?" Fan Xian's heart jumped and he abruptly turned to look at him. Yuan Hongdao gazed at him and said each word clearly, "The Qin family's army has advanced through the night. I'm afraid they are not far from Jingdo." Fan Xian pressed his lips tightly together. His face became pale. He had not panicked even after learning of the news of the City Gate Department's betrayal, because he believed he had a clear grasp of the old Qin family's movements. As long as the army had not arrived, he still had time to retake control of the 9 city gates with the more powerful Imperial Army and Overwatch Council's destructive power. The Qin family's army was about to arrive? Yan Bingyun's father was in the Qin family. How could he not have sent back news of the army's departure? Fan Xian walked to the great prince's side and said, "Withdraw the soldiers and return to the palace. The Qin family's army is about to arrive." The great prince's brows were furrowed tightly. The imperial army had just left the royal palace. Now they had to withdraw because of a piece of news that he could not believe. He knew that what he cared about the most right now was the speed of his reaction. He didn't have time to discuss anything with Fan Xian. Taking a deep breath, he had the soldier at his side wave the little yellow flag in his hand. The yellow flag flipped, and the horn sounded again from above the royal palace. The rhythm gradually picked up and tightened. The imperial army, which was charging out of the royal palace like a few dragons, suddenly heard the sound of the horn returning to camp. Without prior agreement, they all pulled back and began to head back in the direction of the royal palace. In the distance, the group that had already entered deep into the residential streets and alleys also began to move. Fan Xian made a hand gesture to the subordinate beside him. The subordinate nodded and took out an arrow of command from his sleeve. Sending it out, it drew out a wretched cry in the air in front of the royal palace. Immediately after, the sound of an arrow of command rang out from the Bureau of Military Affairs, the headquarters of the Overwatch Council, the offices of the various departments, and the important streets as a response. When the signal arrow fell, the nearly 2,000 secret agents of the Overwatch Council in Jingdo heard the order and moved, disappearing into the streets and alleys. In a moment, not a single person could be seen on the streets of Jingdo, particularly on Tianhe Avenue, which passed through the Overwatch Council and Bureau of Military Affairs and led directly to the royal palace. It was so deserted that it made one's heart palpitate. There were only a few green leaves that had been blown down by the autumn wind and rolled on the empty street. It doesn't matter how the crown prince found out about the raid and escaped. Fan Xian stood beside the great prince and said, "It is clear that the eldest princess left the palace prepared. She had long guessed what we would do." The great prince's brows were furrowed tightly as he looked down at all the activity in Jingdo. He analyzed in his heart which direction the army would enter the capital from and what he should do next. In order to break into the palace, all of our forces killed their way in, but she commanded the armies of the Yi and Qin families, and slowly came in through the city gate guards that we couldn't control. Fan Xian calmly said, "She gave the royal palace to us and then surrounded it to play. Does this count as inviting the enemy into a trap?" I had wanted to have a flower in my stomach and fire on all sides. Unexpectedly, this fire did not burn her. On the contrary, she used a layer of gauze to bind this flower of mine. Fan Xian's palm gently patted the sturdy bricks of the royal palace. Faintly, he said, "In the end, we still underestimated this ant." The eldest princess knew where Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council's advantage was. Thus, she was willing to retreat and let Fan Xian break into the palace and appear to control everything. Presently, the palace had the Empress Dowager, the third prince, Yi Guipin, Ning the Talented, countless nobles, the scholars Hu and Shu, and countless civil officials and subordinates loyal to Fan Xian. These people were power, but they were also a burden. If Fan Xian had a pair of wings, then the people the eldest princess had purposely left in the palace would be like hammers on Fan Xian's wings, preventing him from flying as he pleased. Even if the army surrounded the city, they probably wouldn't be able to surround a terrifying nocturnal ace like Fan Xian. However, he carried the legacy of the Qin kingdom and the lives of countless people in the palace on his shoulders. How could Fan Xian escape? Could he bear to escape? The great prince had been silent the entire time. Occasionally, He would give orders and begin to prepare to defend the royal palace and prepare all the equipment. He did not have the leisure to chat with Fan Xian at such a time. He knew what kind of terrifying danger he was about to face. Fan Xian looked woodenly at everything in Jingdo. It was as if he could see Li Yunrui's extremely beautiful face looking at him with a delicate and timid gaze. Quietly, she said, "My good son-in-law, I have prepared many things for you." He spat toward the palace in the royal palace, as if he wanted to spit on her face. However, he had to admit that his mother-in-law was indeed much stronger than him in these areas. Fan Xian thought to himself that if it weren't for those strange reasons, he would not be trapped in the royal palace right now. "How long can we defend?" he asked the great prince. The great prince's expression was solemn. In a low voice he said, "The royal palace's walls are high. If the Yi and Qin families attack in the middle of the night and don't bring large siege weapons, I can defend until the last moment." As the commander of the Western Expedition Army, the great prince had experienced countless bloody battles in his life. Thus, when faced with the army approaching the capital, he did not panic at all. However, the last moment in this sentence had already explained everything. Since Li Yunrui already had a plan, the Yi and Qin families should have made preparations, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. "I only hope that you can hold out for a few more days. Leading the army into battle can only depend on you. Hold out until the messengers notify the various garrisons and the governors of the 6 roads to send reinforcements?" The great prince swept a glance at him and said rudely, "Give up on that thought. It is impossible for those messengers to still be alive." Fan Xian sighed in his heart and thought, "I am not waiting for those people. Last night I had a stomachache and tossed and turned in bed. When I woke up today, my mind was completely muddled." Chapter 561. A wave of hurried footsteps rang out on the palace walls. A few armored imperial soldiers rushed in front of the two of them, knelt down on one knee, and said a few words. Fan Xian stood behind the great prince and listened calmly. He did not feel any shock in his heart. After a night of searching, they had captured the empress but not the crown prince. The soldiers sent to the Yi and Qin families had also come up empty. Just like how the eldest princess had sent people to surround the Fan Manor, they had also come up empty. Even though these older figures no longer had the ruthlessness of the past, they could still see the direction of the storm clearly. Since the Yi and Qin families had hardened their hearts to lead the eldest princess in rebellion, how could they let Fan Xian and the others capture any useful hostages? As for the other personal officials, they split up to report to the great prince on the current defensive situation in Jingdo. The great prince furrowed his brows slightly as he listened. He waved his hand for them to leave. Turning to Fan Xian, he said, "The situation at hand is that if we retreat into the palace according to the plan, it is the same as giving them all the territory outside the royal palace. If the rebel army sets up their formation and surrounds the palace, we will no longer have the power to overturn the situation." Fan Xian looked at him. "The problem is, if we begin to harass the moment the rebel army enters the city, we will only be able to harass them. It won't be of much use at all," the great prince said. "I have too few soldiers in my hands." At this time, the sun had already risen. The red rays of light shone on the vermilion-red walls of the palace and then reflected out, causing the entire palace and the large square in front of it to be enveloped in a warm color. Even the clear and quiet moat at the back of the palace was soaked in a heart-palpitating red, like fresh blood. "If we want to delay, we must attack the moment they enter Jingdo." The great prince looked at the morning sun and narrowed his eyes. The great prince looked at the rising sun and narrowed his eyes. "The problem at hand is that the Overwatch Council's secret agents are blocked off by the 4 walls and have no way of sending in intelligence report. We must guess which city gate the army will enter the capital from. There is some distance from the city gate to the royal palace. It is enough for us to kill some of their spirit, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. If I really have to guess which city gate the army will enter the capital from, I bet Xingyang Gate. I have the same thoughts. The great prince nodded. The rebel army was heading straight for Jingdo from Yuantai camp. The closest city gate was Xingyang Gate. Furthermore, the offices of the 13 city gate guards were also located there. Although Zhang Diqing had rebelled, only that city gate was personally controlled by him. It was the safest and smoothest route for the eldest princess army to enter the capital through that gate. The first prince frowned and said, I left a group of cavalry there. Fan Xian glanced at him. A strange light flashed through his eyes. The difference in strength between them and the enemy was too great. It was impossible to defend against the enemy outside the city gate. However, he and the great prince had to give the rebel army a deep, memorable blow the moment they entered the city. Only then could they reduce the rebel army's spirit. However, this group of soldiers would definitely be swallowed up by the surging power of the army, and not a single one of them would survive. Seeming to sense what Fan Xian was thinking, the great prince furrowed his brows slightly and said in a low voice, As a soldier of the Qin kingdom, it is only right that we risk our lives. Fan Xian thought bitterly. It was only a struggle for power among the emperor's family, yet they wanted these common soldiers to shed their blood. At this moment, a gust of morning wind swept past. Along with the wind were some voices filled with hot-bloodedness and murderous intent. It was the colonels of the imperial army who had begun to mobilize their subordinates for the final battle. For a time, the atmosphere inside and outside the imperial city was somber, and the air seemed to be filled with tension. I ask you one last time, do you want to leave? The great prince narrowed his eyes and looked at the city gate in the east. He didn't even glance at Fan Xian. Once the army has surrounded the palace, it will be impossible to break through. He and Fan Xian had discussed this a number of times. The great prince was willing to lead the imperial army to lure the rebel army into Jingdo to carry out a bloody slaughter. Fan Xian, with the help of 1,000 Overwatch Council secret agents, would lead the people in the palace to find a way out, kill their way out of the city gates, and quickly head south to Weizhou. Fan Xian gently shook his head, just like he had the last few times they had discussed it. Putting aside the possibility of success in breaking through, even if they could, he would not let the great prince be torn to pieces by the eldest princess's army alone. Furthermore, he still had a great hope in his heart that kept his feet firmly on the palace walls. He followed the direction of the great prince's gaze and stared at the increasingly solemn Xingyang Gate under the rising sun. He didn't say a word. Jingdo did not wake up with the rise of the sun. Hundreds of thousands of commoners stayed in their homes in fear, straining their ears to listen to the movements outside. The streets between the private residences, Tianhe Avenue, and various yamens were all empty and silent. It was so quiet and cold that it made one feel that the early day was still an endless night. Jingdo had become an isolated city, a dead city. An ominous sound suddenly came through the morning wind. It seemed that the heavy Jingdo city gates had been opened by someone. There was no sound of horse hooves or horse neighing. There was no sound of armor and long swords clashing against each other. There was no military banner fluttering. At such a distance, one shouldn't be able to hear the sound of the city gates opening and closing. In such a deathly silent Jingdo, any strange movement from the city gates would touch on the sensitive thoughts of the people in the royal palace. Fan Xian abruptly turned his head and looked in a few directions to the west and south. He focused on the green smoke that the Overwatch Council secret agents had risked their lives to send out. His pupils constricted slightly. A moment later, he and the great prince met each other's eyes and said, "We all guessed wrong." The expression on the great prince's face was extremely serious as he nodded his head. Green smoke rose in all directions as the horn gradually sounded. Looking down from the royal palace, One could see that dozens of clumps of dust had appeared on the outer walls of Jingdo in different directions. The sound of hooves was like thunder. It was rumbling from the city gates, following the roads in all directions in Jingdo, toward the royal palace. Fan Xian and the great prince had guessed that the rebel army would enter the capital through Xingyang Gate. They had not expected that the rebel army would enter the capital so openly and forcefully from all 9 city gates at the same time. The 2 princes on the palace walls sucked in a breath of cold air and wondered just how many people the eldest princess had in the rebel army. They dared to divide their forces to enter the capital through the 9 city gates and openly suppress the city, creating such a terrifying scene. In an instant, Jingdo was surrounded by smoke. Outside Jingdo's Xingyang Gate, the yellow earth was crushed by the galloping hooves of horses. It was then kicked up and turned into a cloud of dust and smoke. It gradually rose and became a cloud of yellow smoke, blocking out the light from the rising sun above the horizon. It made both inside and outside the city gate somewhat dark. The 5,000-man cavalry army rode in a row of 5 at a steady speed toward the wide-open Xingyang Gate. Everything appeared silent and fast. The dust kicked up by the horses' hooves was swept into the city gates by the charge of these fine horses. It looked like a headless and tailless yellow dragon struggling endlessly into Jingdo with the intention of swallowing those pitiful commoners. In the yellow soil that filled the sky, a large military flag was fluttering in the wind. A large Qin character was painted on the black flag. The last stroke of the Qin character was forcefully thrust out. It looked like an indestructible power. Even in the sky full of dust, it was still full of murderous intent. The former deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, the present commander of the Jingdo garrison, and the leading figure of the second generation of the Qin family, Qin Heng, was under this flag. He calmly watched his army enter Jingdo with an unstoppable aura. He narrowed his eyes but did not cover his mouth and nose to avoid breathing in the yellow soil. He only calmly watched all of this. An unusually complicated emotion rose in his chest. As the commander of the Jingdo garrison, he was very familiar with Xingyang Gate. He knew that if the city gates were tightly shut and they only relied on these 3,000 riders, they would probably not be able to charge into Jingdo even after 3 years. The Qin kingdom's capital had been surrounded by foreign enemies before, but it had never been broken into the city. This Jingdo, which did not have a long history, fully demonstrated its powerful defensive power. Now, this Jingdo city gate had finally fallen. Just as Zhuang Mohan had once said in his book, the most powerful capitals in history were often taken from the inside. The Qin kingdom's rebellion this time was no exception. Qin Heng watched all of this. As a soldier of the Qin kingdom, his emotions were complicated. He felt great admiration and fear for the eldest princess, who had easily taken control of the 13 city gate guards. However, the present situation did not allow him to think too much. The army had entered the capital through 9 city gates. The group of riders he led went through Xingyang Gate. He had to reach the royal palace before everyone else. This time, the army had gathered the armies of the Qin and Yi families, as well as the Jingdo garrison. There were 30,000 people in total, while the royal palace's defensive power added up to less than 6,000 people. The army entering the capital had to be open and aboveboard. They had to suppress the people in the royal palace until their hearts trembled and they surrendered. For Qin Heng, fighting this battle with 6 against 1 was not a difficult matter. He had never thought that the people he was familiar with in the royal palace would be able to oppose such a powerful army. The horses and soldiers rushing past in front of him flashed through his eyes. Then, a person's name flashed through his mind. For Qin Heng, he was not worried about the royal palace. He was worried that Yi Zhong would reach the royal palace before him. Thinking of Yi Zhong's name, Qin Heng let out a murky breath. This permanent member of the Jingdo garrison had received the Empress Dowager's edict but had not returned to Dingzhou. Although it seemed that the Yi family's refusal to retreat was secretly arranged by the eldest princess and had great significance for the Jingdo battle, for the Qin family, the existence of the Yi family's military power had a different meaning. Yi Zhong was the second prince's father-in-law, and the Qin family naturally supported the crown prince. Thus, the old Qin master had given a death order. In order to stabilize the crown prince's throne, the Qin family's army had to perform valiantly in this battle and arrive before the Yi family. Qin Hing squeezed his horse's abdomen and led his personal camp to join the troops entering the city. He became the brightest scale on the yellow dragon. The rebel army entered Jingdo from 9 directions. The Qin family took 6, and the Yi family took 3. Because the rebel army was powerful and knew that Jingdo's defenses were weak, they didn't care about the problem of splitting up. On the contrary, entering with such a large force could make the royal palace lose the courage to break out again. The thousands of soldiers of the 13 city gate guards did not join the rebel army. The common soldiers watched this scene dumbfounded. They didn't know what had happened. Some clever officers had already guessed that one of the princes had rebelled, but they didn't dare move under the suppression of their officers. Commander Zhang Diqing was a clever man. He knew that in this kind of rebellion, even if he added a hand, he wouldn't be able to do much. Holding tightly to his own city gate guards was the truly clever choice. The sound of horse hooves rang out like thunder on the road from Xingyang Gate to the royal palace. The riders of the Qin army took out their weapons and became cautious. However, their speed did not decrease at all. They galloped past like a gust of wind. The color of the Qin family's light armor was also very dark. It was very similar to the Overwatch Council's Black Knights. However, it was missing a smear of the thickest black. There were a few patches of bright color on the chest of the armor. A dozen running riders suddenly broke away from the group and sped forward. Like lightning, they pierced into the quiet street. Brushing against the low eaves of private residences, they began to scout and report on the army's advance. Everything went as usual. These riders galloped into the streets, turned, and spread out like an arrowhead. They began to advance deep into the city. All of this happened quickly and naturally. It fully demonstrated the Qin army's level of training and the power of the Qin army. The main group of riders did not slow down. They continued forward in the direction the riders had stepped in. Qin Hing rode on his horse and led his personal camp. He stared coldly at the area in front of him. He knew that Fan Xian and the great prince would not sit and wait for death. On this quiet street, there would certainly be ambushes and difficult killing. He didn't care how many people Fan Xian and the great prince had in their hands. He knew that what he wanted was the speed of the army and a powerful aura. No matter what kind of obstruction they faced, they had to use the army to ruthlessly crush through. The speed of the rebel army's advance was too fast. The riders at the front were unable to serve as scouts. They were just bravely bait. They were a bit like the martyrs in Fan Xian's world who bravely rolled through minefield. They used their lives to touch the deathly silent Jingdo and see just what kind of danger existed. However, the rebel army had already advanced 5,000 zhang from Xingyang Gate. The dozen or so brave riders still did not encounter any snipers. Even when they could faintly see the eaves of the imperial palace illuminated by the rising sun, the streets were still quiet. Hiss! About 300 feet away from the riders, the war horses at the very front of the rebel army were breathing in Jingdo's air forcefully and maintaining a steady speed. At the same time, they began to whinny in pain. The whinny stopped. A number of war horses fell to the ground at the same time. The war horses' heavy bodies crashed ruthlessly into the green stone floor of the street, sending up a few strands of dust. It seemed to shake the entire street. The horse's head crashed heavily into the ground. Fresh blood spurted out. No matter how skilled the riders on the war horses were, they were caught unprepared by this sudden change, and fell to the ground. Before they could recover from the pain of their broken legs, A few black poisoned crossbow bolts shot out from the private residences on the side of the street and pierced ruthlessly into their bodies. Just as the first few warhorses fell to the ground and the riders were killed by the crossbow bolts, countless hissing sounds suddenly came from the quiet street. These sounds did not come from the mouths and noses of the galloping warhorses. Instead, they came from the ground. The streets of Jingdo were paved with square stones. The gaps between the stones were filled with yellow soil. The hissing sounds came from the fine yellow soil between the stones. At the same time, the yellow soil between the stones on the long street suddenly split open. There seemed to be some mysterious power on the two sides of the street. From the cracked yellow soil, thin black leather ropes shot up. The leather ropes were too thin and could not be tied to hooks. However, a faint light could be faintly seen. They should be thin needles dipped in poison. Dozens of specially made black horse tripping ropes suddenly and magically appeared on the street that had been flat just a moment ago. Countless muffled sounds rang out at the same time. The Qin army's main cavalry unit suffered a merciless attack. About 100 riders in total fell from the clouds in front of these dozens of horse-tripping ropes and smashed into the deep ground. For a moment, people and horses were thrown off their feet on the street. Wretched cries rang out. Countless people or horses had their tendons snapped or their bones broken. They crashed heavily into one another, rolling and bleeding. Immediately after, the whooshing sound of something breaking through the air rang out. These sounds were like whistles from the netherworld coming to collect lives. It made people's hearts tremble. Countless black crossbow bolts shot out from the private residences on the side of the street and landed on the bodies of the rebel soldiers on the ground. In an instant, their wretched cries stopped. In just a moment, there were more than 100 dead people on this half of the street. These dead people all had crossbow bolts stuck in their bodies. The ambushers did not shoot the horses. The poisoned warhorses lay powerlessly on the ground beside the bodies of their owners. As they whinnied in pain, they kicked their legs. The scene was incomparably wretched. Chapter 562. Actually, I had been sick for a few days. After the stomach pain, I caught a cold, and then I had a rhinitis. Today, it had finally reached its peak. I had been sitting in front of the computer for a few hours, and I had also gone to the toilet a few times. In total, I had only written a few hundred words. It was not a problem with my body, but with my mind. I had really been in so much pain that I could not write anymore. I did not write much in July, and the quality would definitely drop. This was something that I had helplessly predicted at the beginning of the month. People always had more important things to do in their lives. I felt apologetic, so I did not ask for votes this month. I asked everyone to vote for other colleagues who were more hard-working. But I did not expect that on the last day of the month, Qin Yu's monthly votes would actually squeeze into the top 6. Thinking of this, I could not help but feel endless gratitude towards everyone. Everyone is a kind person, even more kind than me. After returning home for the past 10 days, I have been working hard to write, wanting to make up for it. But I did not expect that I would not be able to persist on the last day of the month. It is really a pity, and I am also a little disappointed. Chapter 563. On the first day of August, as usual, I am earnestly and sincerely pulling for monthly vote. Please give the monthly votes in your hands to me. I will write them seriously. I cannot promise they will be good, but I promise I will do my best. Thank you, everyone. After this obstruction, the Qin family rebel army's momentum was forced to a halt. Their formation, bound by the Jingdo streets, couldn't help but panic. At this moment, a number of explosive shouts rang out from within the army. At the first instant, a clear and powerful order was given, stabilizing the vanguard camp. Immediately after, the shield-holding soldiers caught up from behind. Stepping over the pools of blood on Chang Street, they bravely broke through the wooden doors of the private residences on both sides of the street and charged into those dark spaces. For a moment, the streets were filled with the sound of killing, but the true situation of the killing could not be seen. With a crash, a large hole opened up in a private residence. A rebel soldier covered in blood was stabbed to death and fell out. Inside those private residences, there were still countless soldiers and Overwatch Council subordinates lying in ambush, carrying out a dangerous killing. The rebel army's discipline was strict. When Qin Heng coldly gave the order to use the lives of a large number of soldiers as the price to launch a counterattack toward the two sides of the street, the rain of crossbows attacking from all directions weakened. A bright knife light flashed. Dozens of treacherous horse-tripping ropes on the stone pavement of the street were neatly cut. These black leather ropes were like poisonous snakes with their heads cut off. They lay limply on the ground. The poisonous needles, shining with a metallic luster, were like the shiny liquid on the snakeskin. Qin Heng sat on his horse and stared ahead under the military flag. Abruptly, he picked up the horsewhip in his hand and lashed it down forcefully. A fierce general at his side gave a muffled grunt. Holding a long spear in his hand, he yelled, "Kill!" His legs squeezed the horse's abdomen. Leading hundreds of riders, he once again charged toward Chang Street. For a moment, there was only the sound of horse hooves rolling up like wind and thunder with an imposing aura. There were still wretched cries on Chang Street. There were still the sounds of knives sinking into bones in the private residences and the muffled sounds of bodies falling to the ground. It was difficult to see the figures of Overwatch Council subordinate. They only knew that these people were carrying out the killing work in the private residences on the side of the street. Gradually, blood seeped out from under the wooden doors. The fierce general of the Qin clan's vanguard camp ignored him and led his subordinates to charge on the long street. Only to see this person's long spear thrust out, stirring up a strong gust of wind, and with a cha sound, it pierced into a wooden door beside the horse. With a roar that shook the heavens, the general pulled back his spear. There was a black-clothed man on the spear. Fresh blood dripped from the spear. The tip of the spear had pierced through the chest of the Overwatch Council secret agent. The general under the armor released a muffled groan. With a shake of his arm, the corpse on the spear tip was flung out like a paper bag. He took the lead on a horse and once again stepped over the corpses and pools of blood on the street. Once again, he galloped forward. The black spear in his hand was completely forged from iron and steel. It was mighty and powerful, and the spear was not weak at all. Along the street, it actually picked up 5 wooden doors and killed several people in quick succession. Qin Heng stared coldly at his most ferocious general from the back. He waved his hand and ordered the entire army to press forward. He was prepared to use a powerful military force to directly suppress the Overwatch Council snipers on both sides of the street. Although they had lost nearly 200 soldiers in their first encounter, Qin Heng's state of mind did not tremble at all. He had never thought that the Overwatch Council's methods in the dark could directly stop the advance of a large army. An Overwatch Council official holding a crossbow appeared on the building in front of them on the left. Through the window, he took aim at the vanguard general. Unexpectedly, before he had time to pull the trigger, an arrow had already shot into his eye socket. The official gave a muffled groan and fell down the building. Immediately after, a series of whooshing sounds rang out. The dozens of bodyguards following the vanguard general on horseback on the street held light bows in their hands and shot to the left and right. Arrows flew out quickly. Immediately, many arrow holes appeared in the small buildings and private residences on both sides of the street. The Overwatch Council subordinates lying in ambush were preparing to use their crossbows to kill the vanguard general when they were all struck and fell. Of the 3 powers in the world, the Qing army was the strongest in riding and shooting. At this moment, they were riding on the long street and holding hard bows in their hand. In an instant, the Overwatch Council crossbowmen didn't dare reveal themselves. Even though there were occasional arrows that flew out from the two sides, they did not seem to be very accurate. They hit the heavy armor on the vanguard general's body, but were unable to penetrate deep into his body. They only produced a few blooms of blood. In the blink of an eye, the Qin family general had already led the vanguard battalion to charge over 100 zhang, and behind him was the vast cavalry. In front of them was an open field, and there was no longer anything that could stop them from charging into the imperial palace. At this moment, a mournful signal arrow rang out on the long street. Pa 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 pa. The windows of the houses on both sides of the street were all closed. Although the killing in the houses continued, the long street had returned to peace. It was an extremely strange peace. The vanguard general's face was covered in blood and dirt. His expression was murderous. With a shake of his long spear, he pulled it behind his back. Like a mountain-splitting axe, he pierced toward the end of the street. Although he had noticed the strange scene on both sides of the street, he did not feel a glimmer of fear. Now that the charge had been formed, how could the Overwatch Council's tricks stop the advance of the army? Scoundrels, he thought disdainfully. Scoundrels. Qin Hung led the army and pressed toward the long street. With a stern expression, he looked at the street that had suddenly recovered its silence. He thought with slight mockery that the Overwatch Council still could not see the light of day. Right at this moment, a signal suddenly rang out on the long street that had regained its peace after the signal arrow. This signal only had one word. Ho! This ho was very simple. It was clean and tidy, but it contained boundless killing intent. Qin Heng's pupils constricted slightly. He raised his eyebrows. The rebel soldiers pulled back their bows. Countless arrows shot out, piercing toward the place where the order had come from. Thud, thud, thud. Like rain hitting a city, the wooden building was immediately pierced with countless holes. The long arrows pierced through the wind. There was only a faint, muffled grunt. The Overwatch Council official who had given the order had died. Immediately after, there was only the sound of horse hooves, the muffled sounds of killing, and the sound of arrows piercing through the air. The order rang out again, ho! Qin Heng's expression became gloomy. He held onto the reins and ran on the street. He didn't know what the Overwatch Council's ho meant. He could have chosen to split his forces and go around this section of the street where the Overwatch Council was heavily ambushed. He could have chosen a more reliable method. However, military orders were like a mountain. Since his father had ordered him to be the first to reach the royal palace, he had to maintain his speed, even if he had to pay an even greater price. Thus, he suddenly waved the whip in his hand. The thousands of rebel soldiers on the street shouted in unison, "Kill!" Like a flood, the group of lightly armored rebel soldiers charged toward the empty and dangerous street. The vanguard general, who no one dared to stop with a long spear in his hand, had already led the dozens of riders behind him to the end of the street. Behind him, Xingyang Gate glowed under the morning sun. The open space in front of him was attracting him. Further away, he could faintly see the royal palace still waiting for his attack. Thus, he was filled with heroism and courage. Then, he suddenly heard the thunderous sound of hooves. Then, he saw that at the empty end of the long street, over 200 cavalry had suddenly appeared. These cavalry had appeared at some point in time. They wore bright armor and held long blades in their hands. They silently and coldly waited for the rebel army to arrive. Beside these cavalrymen, there were more than 10 scattered corpses. They were the 10 or so scouts sent out by the Qin clan's rebel army. Not only were the scouts dead, but even the war horses had fallen to the ground. The Qin vanguard general's pupils constricted. He knew these riders were tough. Otherwise, they could not have killed a dozen of his subordinates without making a sound. It was the imperial army. He could no longer stop. The vanguard general gripped the metal spear in his hand tightly. The roughness and coldness of the spear made him feel boundless confidence. Then, He squeezed his horse's belly and led the dozens of riders behind him toward the Imperial army. The Imperial Army general's entire body was covered in armor. Only his eyes were exposed. There was not a glimmer of emotion in these eyes. There was only calmness, coldness, and determination. The coldness toward his own life, and the determination to complete the mission the commander had given him. He raised the saber in his hand high. The edge of the blade flashed with light, making one shiver. He squeezed his horse's belly. The warhorse under him suddenly struggled and shot out like an arrow from a bow. Just like that, the hundreds of cavalrymen charged forward with indomitable courage. They were like two different colored torrents that were about to collide head-on. Just at this moment, an Overwatch Council order suddenly rang out on the long street that had just been silent for a moment. Release. The Qin Vanguard general's eyes were blood-red as he watched the Imperial Army riders charging toward him at high speed. With an explosive roar, his horse suddenly sped up. He was just about to charge out of the street when he suddenly heard this sound. His state of mind was firm and ruthless. There was not a glimmer of panic or slowing down. He didn't care at all about the scoundrels of the Overwatch Council. What he cared about was the valiant Imperial Army in front of him. He had to open a bloody path for the general and a bloody path to the royal palace. A black shadow was thrown out from a private residence by the side of the street. It just happened to appear in the air in front of the Vanguard general's horse. The Vanguard general raised his elbow. The tip of the spear flashed. With a ripping sound, the black shadow was immediately torn to shreds. Cloth flew wildly. The powder inside was swept into the air. Some of it landed on the Vanguard general's body, but most of it landed on his horse. He held his breath. His eyes were blood-red. He knew that the Overwatch Council's use of poison was powerful, but he was not afraid. As long as the poison did not enter his heart for a moment, he would be able to force back the approaching Imperial Army. However, he was worried about his horse. Steeling his heart, he struck the back of the spear viciously against the horse's rump. The horse was startled and sped up again. A series of springs rang out. On the street that had been calm for a long time, the crossbow bolts came again. The Qin Vanguard general huffed coldly and swung his spear to protect his vitals and the head of his horse. A gust of wind swept out. Countless crossbow bolts fell to the ground. Occasionally, a few bolts hit his armor. With a crisp clang, they fell powerlessly to the ground. This Vanguard general abruptly discovered that among the rain of crossbow bolts, there were a few smears of unlucky red. Red? Fire? With a swish, 3 crossbow bolts landed separately on the Vanguard general's heavy armor and the head of his horse. The crossbow bolts had fire cotton tied to them and were burning with tiny flames. In the red morning sun, they were not obvious, but they were particularly fatal. The moment the flames touched the powder on the heavy armor, they began to burn with a whoosh. From the horse's head to the heavy armor and then to the helmet, wherever it touched the powder, the flames immediately spread. In the blink of an eye, the fire burned fiercely and enveloped the Vanguard general in flames. Chi-chi, a terrible roar came from the flames. At this time, the Vanguard was still maintaining his charging posture, but he had already become a burning torch. He roared in terror and threw away the spear in his hand, trying to put out the fire on his body. However, this had already become something he could never do. The fire the Overwatch Council had set was not so easy to put out. He knew he was done for. His heart was filled with incomparable terror. The horse was in great pain and let loose a wild gallop. Shrouded in flames, the rider and horse charged terrifyingly to the front of the Imperial Army's front line. The general of the Imperial Army looked coldly and mockingly at the man on fire charging toward him. As the two riders passed each other, he swung his long knife with a flash. The knife came out without a sound. It passed through the fire and chopped off the head of the Vanguard general. With a crack, the head broke off. Tied by the neck armor, it burned in the flames. The flaming horse let out a mournful cry as it charged blindly. Carrying its headless master, it crashed head first into an alley wall on the side of the street. With an extremely heavy muffled sound, both the horse and the master fell to the ground, neighing miserably. No one looked at them. There were only 200 or so riders of the Imperial Army. At this moment they maintained a very high speed. They stepped over the bodies of the vanguard soldiers that had been shot into beehives and burned into charcoal. They charged toward the center of the army where Qin Heng was. Qin Heng didn't know what kind of shameless and sinister murder his most valued vanguard had suffered. After hearing the Overwatch Council's second call for an order, he had already ordered his army to begin pressing toward the two sides of Chong Street because the Overwatch Council's second attack had already begun. After a long silence and the two cold calls for an order, the rain of crossbow bolts fired toward the rebel soldiers became even more intense. Most of them were aimed at the center of the military flag, particularly where Qin Heng's personal camp was. "It's a repeating crossbow." Finally, a rebel soldier cried out timidly. Amidst the howling of crossbow bolts breaking through the wind, this cry was particularly heart-shaking. Do 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 do. A series of densely packed strikes rang out. The first arrow was blocked, but what about the second and third? A dozen personal soldiers bravely stood in front of Qin Heng's horse. They only had elbow shields in their hands. It was not enough to block such a dense and fast crossbow bolt. They used their bodies and the large bodies of their warhorses to act as meat shields for Qin Heng. On Chong Street, people and horses were thrown off their feet. Tragic cries rang out repeatedly. Countless rebel soldiers had crossbow bolts stuck into their faces. Fresh blood and sweat mixed together. Everywhere there were cries for help. In just an instant, most of the soldiers around Qin Heng had died. Qin Heng knew that the Overwatch Council's target was him. His face was covered in blood and dirt. His expression appeared particularly sinister amidst the blood and dirt. It was not until this moment that he finally confirmed that Fan Xian had the Overwatch Council lie in ambush at Xingyang Gate, not just to block and stall for time. He was prepared to put his life on the line, to keep his life here. Although he didn't know why Fan Xian valued his life so much, he was stern and fearless. He only looked at the initially calm Chong Street, which was now filled with the sound of crossbow bolts, and his subordinates bravely and helplessly fighting against the poisonous powder and hidden crossbow bolts. A vein appeared on his temple. A wave of anger filled his chest. These scoundrels only knew how to use such unorthodox method. Did they dare to delude themselves into trapping him? He pulled out the long sword at his waist and squeezed his horse's belly. The horse leaped like a dragon and leaped out amidst the crossbow bolt. He roared, "For the Qin kingdom, kill!" The commander began to risk his life to charge the formation. The morale of the rebel soldiers rose greatly. In unison, they cried out, "Kill!" and charged deep into the two sides of the street through the rain of crossbow bolt. They used their bodies and lives to slightly suppress the Overwatch Council's second wave of attack. After all, the rebel soldiers had the advantage of numbers. As long as they could come into direct contact with the Overwatch Council officials hiding in the darkness, they would obtain the final victory. However, at this moment, the Imperial soldiers at the other end of the street had already charged over. There were only 200 riders, but it was like there were 2,000. Thunder rumbled and a murderous aura surged. Their power could not be stopped. Like a flood, they charged into the Qin family army, which had already been forced to scatter. Both sides wore armor and had knives in their hands. Murderous intent boiled to the heavens. Although the Qin family army's formation was a bit messy, on the not very wide Chong Street, this was a head-on collision with no path of retreat. The two cavalries, which were advancing at high speed, had their first head-on collision on the long street below Xingyang Gate. Like two large iron hammers, they fiercely smashed into each other, giving rise to an ear-piercing and incomparably terrifying loud sound. In an instant, countless riders fell from their horses and were trampled. The people on the horses were stabbed to death, squeezed to death, chopped to death, or shaken to death. Knives and spears collided, armor collided, and auras collided. Qin Heng looked at this scene with an ashen face. He wondered how many people Fan Xian and the Great Prince had to have so many people lying in ambush below Xingyang Gate. "I've smashed all the soldiers that can move inside Xingyang Gate." Fan Xian stared at the smoke in Jingdo and said with a heavy expression, "Although I hadn't guessed that they would be so powerful as to enter from 9 city gates, since they have smashed inside Xingyang Gate, I had to make some noise." The Great Prince glanced at him, and then at the gradually approaching rebel army flags in the Jingdo street. He couldn't help his pupils constricting slightly. In the end, it is only one path. The general trend cannot be reversed. In that instant earlier, if you had charged out from inside Xingyang Gate, perhaps you would have had a chance to break out. "The eldest princess must have backup troops outside Jingdo," Fan Xian said. "Break out? What would I use to break out? Didn't Jing Gu take 200 black knights and disappear from Jingdo?" The Great Prince glanced at him. Fan Xian didn't reply. He only looked at the square below the royal palace with a heavy expression. This square was very large. During the military parade, tens of thousands of people had lined up. At this moment, he could faintly feel the ground trembling. Presumably, the 8 paths of rebel soldiers were about to surround them. Even though he had long seen through the concept of life and death, he couldn't help but feel his heart begin to tremble. He raised his head and looked in the direction of Xingyang Gate. He knew that the strength that he and the Great Prince had left outside the palace was mostly concentrated in that path. Regardless of who wanted to reach the palace from there, they would probably have to pay a heavy price. If he knew that it was the second-generation leading figure of the Qin family who was, at this moment, struggling to advance through crossbow bolts and poisonous smoke, he would probably laugh out loud. Fan Xian had always firmly remembered the Qin family's attack in the valley. However, he didn't know how many of those loyal Overwatch Council subordinates, as well as the Imperial Army's suicidal cavalry, would survive a moment later. Just as the Great Prince had said, a mere city gate was not enough to change the general trend. At the foot of the royal palace, a rider appeared at the corner of the street at the edge of the square. At this moment, the Imperial Army had all gathered into the palace. The square outside the palace gates was completely empty. Thus, the rider's appearance was very abrupt. It was as if a discordant black dot had suddenly appeared in the empty space. Amidst the clattering of horse hooves, the rider did not stop to rest. From the edge of the square, he charged straight to the center of the square and came to the front of the royal palace. Behind this cavalryman, a second cavalryman appeared, a third cavalryman, a 10th cavalryman, a 100th cavalryman, a 1000th cavalryman. 8 of the Qin and Yi family's armies, after sweeping away any resistance along the way, finally arrived in front of the imperial city like a dark cloud pressing down on the city. The densely packed rebel soldiers silently and coldly surrounded the entire royal palace. The murderous aura seeping through the silence and the steady aura made the hearts of the imperial soldiers on the palace walls tremble for no reason. Fan Xian and the Great Prince finally stopped chatting to hide the nervousness in their hearts. They silently watched everything in front of them. A moment later, a flag fluttering in the morning wind appeared in everyone's field of view. This flag came from the corner of the square on the long street. A large Qin character was revealed on it. Another rider came swiftly from the other side of the palace walls. In his hand was a large flag with the Yi character written on it. The last thing that appeared was a bright yellow flag. There was not a single word on it. There was only a dragon soaring through the clouds embroidered with golden thread. Its golden claws shattered the auspicious clouds as it stepped through the air. Even the dragon flag has been openly displayed. Fan Xian was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. The Qin and Yi family armies were too powerful. Although he was a 9th-level ace and had an incomparably firm temperament, he still couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle when faced with the densely packed army. "Are you afraid?" The great prince looked at him expressionlessly. "Anything will appear terrifying when there are too many of them. Ants are like this, mice are like this, cockroaches are like this, much less people." Fan Xian summoned a subordinate and said a few words. The 3 large flags moved slowly. Under the burning gazes of the rebel soldiers around the square, and the slightly fearful gazes of the Imperial Army guards, they came to the front of the royal palace. They came behind the first rider to enter the square and fluttered in the wind. "You've been stubbornly refusing to break through. I always thought you still had some trump card up your sleeve," the great prince said slowly as he looked at the riders and flags in front of the royal palace with narrowed eyes. "My trump card is long gone," Fan Xian said without changing his expression. Fan Xian's expression did not change as he said, "But, I always thought that those old fellows wouldn't just leave us to die. I always thought that since the rebel army had already entered the city, they would jump out and pretend to be super scions. Unfortunately, it seems that I guessed wrong." "What are scions?" The great prince twitched the corner of his mouth. "I am also very confused. Has Director Qin really been poisoned?" Fan Xian looked at the mountainous army in front of the royal palace and suddenly took a deep breath. "Slapping the bricks of the royal palace," he said. "Even if it's the 2 of us, so what?" The great prince looked at him deeply and said, "I don't want to die with you." The storm was coming and the buildings were filled with worry. The 2 worried people in the corner of the royal palace were joking. The surrounding Imperial Army soldiers secretly watched this scene and listened to the Duke and Commander's hearty laughter. For some reason, they also felt that the rebel soldiers in front of the royal palace were not as terrifying as they had imagined. The great prince looked at the 3 lonely flags in front of the royal palace and the rider at the very front. He smiled slightly and said, "They are using their aura to suppress us and try to make the Imperial Army afraid. My subordinates would not be so cowardly. Why did we throw all the cards in our hands at Jinggyang Gate?" Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the 4 riders standing in front of the royal palace. "It was to kill the enemy's spirit and raise the morale of our army." "Then, how could we allow these 4 riders to stand so arrogantly in front of the royal palace as a demonstration?" According to military tradition, the first rider to arrive will receive unparalleled glory. Fan Xian stared at the rider like a black dot. A moment later, he suddenly said, "Then, let him lose his glory." The great prince furrowed his brows. As the commander of the Western Expedition Army, he had a natural respect for the Qing Kingdom's military tradition. Although he greatly disliked the riders silently showing off their strength in front of the royal palace, he had never thought of doing anything. Furthermore, they were standing in a good position. It would be difficult for arrows to reach them. Fan Xian said resolutely and decisively, "I am not a soldier. I also don't understand glory. I only know that this is a matter of life and death. To still stand in front of me at this time, that is—" Before he finished his sentence, his hand had already swung down. The city-guarding crossbow in the corner of the royal palace, that had been silent for countless years, suddenly let out a wretched cry. It was as if it wanted to wake up all the resentful spirits that had once died in the royal palace. Click! After the loud sound of a spring, a crossbow bolt as thick as a child's arm left the crossbow mechanism like lightning and shot out along a preset trajectory. The riders and banners standing alone in front of the royal palace were lonely but arrogant. They looked coldly and disdainfully at the imperial soldiers on the palace walls, conveying a powerful intimidation and pressure. All of this was broken by the sound of the crossbow. The first rider to enter the boundaries of the royal palace didn't even have time to raise his head before the massive crossbow bolt pierced through his body and into the body of his warhorse. Accompanied by a large spray of blood, the man and horse were ruthlessly nailed to the stone tiles of the square. Chapter 564. The arrow of the city-guarding crossbow was like a short spear. It pierced through the flesh and blood of man and horse, piercing deeply into the cracks between the stone tiles of the square. The fine iron arrow, as thick as a child's arm, trembled endlessly and made a buzzing sound. It brought the blood of the rider's body under the arrow with it. Many people were unable to react, including the rebel army and the imperial guards on the palace walls. Tens of thousands of people stared dumbly at this scene, not daring to believe their eyes. Such a huge crossbow bolt had pierced through the cavalry's body. It was more like an iron rod from the heavens, ruthlessly smashing down from beyond the clouds. A death-like silence and an icy fear spread through the square. On the rider's body that had fallen gloriously, the three banner-holding officers also did not react. They looked stupidly at the rider in front of them, who had become bloody foam, and the internal organs that had been squeezed out of the ground. They didn't know how to react. Horses were different from humans. Even though they were war horses that had been chosen out of 10,000, when they saw this scene and felt the fear of that crossbow arrow, their biological instincts made the three horses neigh in unison. After being startled, they began to gallop to the side. A moment later, 2 military flags fluttered in the morning wind. They returned wretchedly to the rebel army's camp. The other bright yellow dragon flag fell miserably to the flat ground of the square and rolled up into a ball. It looked very unsightly. The soldier holding the flag had been startled by the city-guarding crossbow. The warhorse under him had also galloped in fright. For a moment, he lost his grip and dropped the dragon flag to the ground. The tens of thousands of Qing soldiers on and off the palace walls were still death-like silent. However, their gazes had moved from the bloody mud in the square to the flag. The dragon flag that represented the dignity of the Qing royal family and the Qing army's undefeatable will. This flag that seemed to always fly in front of the army and would not fall had fallen miserably to the ground. The emotions in the tens of thousands of eyes were complicated, angry, and not right. On the palace walls, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and watched this scene. He smiled slightly at the great prince beside him and said, "The effect is good, isn't it?" The great prince did not reply. He thought to himself, the crown prince had raised troops today, yet he had even lost the dragon flag. He had truly embarrassed himself. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls suddenly exploded into cheers in unison. These cheers were, without a doubt, a ruthless whip in the faces of the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers below the palace walls. At that moment, the empty-handed cavalryman who had lost his flag had already returned to the rebel army's camp. He sat on his horse with his head lowered, trembling all over. He knew that he would face severe punishment from the military. As a flag-bearer, this was an honorable position, yet he had accidentally dropped the dragon flag to the ground. The hundreds of riders in the rebel army camp gradually parted. Crown Prince Li Chengqian, dressed in bright armor, slowly walked out under the protection of a few generals. He only glanced at the rider and didn't say anything. The crown prince's gaze was very gentle, but the cavalryman felt extremely ashamed. He gritted his teeth and turned his horse around, preparing to go to the square to snatch back the dragon flag that had fallen to the ground. It did not matter even if he died. At this moment, to everyone's surprise, a general beside the crown prince spurred his horse forward and came to the side of the cavalryman. He said, "When two armies cross swords, the one who loses the flag will be beheaded." The moment the word "beheaded" left his mouth, the cavalryman's body trembled. He unconsciously closed his eyes, but did his best to straighten his body. Then, he felt a chill on his neck. The general pulled back his knife and didn't even glance at the fallen body of the cavalryman beside him. He squeezed out a cold snort from his nose and squeezed the sides of his horse. The handsome horse beneath him shot forward like lightning. In an instant, it galloped out of the rebel army camp and headed straight for the center of the square below the palace walls. It was headed straight for the dragon flag that was curled up on the ground. Not everyone in the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers recognized this general, but they knew what he was going to do. Involuntarily, their hearts trembled and their blood surged. Tens of thousands of people roared in unison and rhythmically. Amidst the iron-blooded and awe-inspiring cries of the tens of thousands of people, the war-horse beneath the general was like a flying dragon. Its 4 hooves seemed to rise into the air as it pierced toward the palace walls like a sharp arrow. Riding alone in the open square under the gaze of tens of thousands of people and the piercing of crossbow bolts on the palace walls, it was very heroic. The speed of the horse was very fast. The rider's skill in controlling the horse was even more impressive. It looked like it was charging in a straight line toward the palace walls. In reality, it was following a strange path. Although it took some detours, it was full of vigor. In only a moment, it had charged to the center of the square. Until now, not a single one of the city-guarding crossbows had been fired. The Imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council soldiers beside the giant city-guarding crossbows broke out in a cold sweat. It was impossible for them to capture the path of the rebel general's advance. Even under such high speed, it seemed that he could still keenly capture the speed of fire and defensive range of the city-guarding crossbows. Fan Xian stared at this scene with narrowed eyes. He felt that in the blink of an eye, this rebel general had already charged to his feet and in front of the dragon flag. The city-guarding crossbows had just demonstrated their power once, and this rebel general had already charged over. Such vigor and courage was truly admirable. For some reason, Fan Xian suddenly thought of 13th Wang. His heart jumped slightly. He was just about to raise his hand when he used a great deal of willpower to order himself to slowly lower it. This small action did not fall into the eyes of the great prince because he was also watching the one-man show of 2 armies fighting for power in front of the palace walls with a stern expression. When 2 armies crossed swords, vigor was the most important. The flag was the power. Capturing the flag was capturing the power. The rebel general on the horse rode to where the dragon flag was. He did not slow down. Using superb riding skills, he hung one foot on the pedal and reached down with one hand. Easily, he picked up the dragon flag. Although Fan Xian had lowered his arm, the group responsible for operating the city-guarding crossbows did not want to pass up this great opportunity. They pulled on the heavy spring of the crossbow mechanism. With a muffled bang, the thick palace walls seemed to tremble with the release of the giant crossbow. The neigh of a horse rose into the sky. The rebel general below the palace walls seemed to have guessed when the city-guarding crossbows would fire. He raised the reins and kicked his beloved horse's abdomen with both feet. With a wild roar, he had the horse stand up on its hind legs. The warhorse's front hooves hung in the air as its massive body was forcefully twisted. It even hovered in the air in a stupefying manner. The rebel general held the bright yellow dragon flag in one hand and fiercely raised the reins in the other. He sat diagonally on the rearing warhorse. Illuminated by the morning sun, he appeared heroic and fierce. At this moment, the giant city-guarding crossbow finally arrived in front of them and brushed past the warhorse's abdomen. It stabbed down diagonally and viciously. The iron crossbow, as thick as a child's arm, pierced into the stone slabs of the square. Shattered stones flew everywhere, but it did not even graze a hair on the rebel general's body. The rebel general twisted his left elbow and pulled in the reins again. The head of the horse under him turned to the left. With a neigh, its 2 hooves landed on the ground. All the muscles in its body relaxed and tightened. Like a wisp of smoke, it galloped directly back to the rebel army camp and back to the crown prince's side. The rebel general did not dismount. He only heavily stabbed the bright yellow dragon flag into the ground. The flagpole entered the ground but did not fall. The dragon flag once again fluttered in the morning wind and shone brilliantly. Then, he turned his horse's head and was silent as he looked at the 2 black dots on the palace walls. In just a few breaths, this rebel general had done what most people could not do. From the moment he leaped out of the camp, tens of thousands of rebel soldiers began to cheer. As he took back the dragon flag and galloped back to the camp, tens of thousands of people's mountainous cheers grew louder and louder. When this rebel general stabbed the dragon flag back into the ground and the flag fluttered in the wind, the cheers of the rebel soldiers finally reached a climax. Impressive! Fan Xian gently wiped away the cold sweat on his palms. At this moment, he expressed an opinion that he should not have expressed as one of the commanders. There are indeed countless fierce generals in the Qing army. No wonder no one can defeat them unhindered under heaven. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "It's Gong Dian. He has been the deputy commander of the Imperial Army for so many years. His understanding of the city-guarding crossbow is much better than yours or mine. Furthermore, he is an 8th level ace. Given his noble status as a general, he bravely risked his life to take back the flag. Such courage is truly admirable." The great prince furrowed his brows slightly and said, "So it's him? No wonder, no wonder. General Gong has been herding horses on the borders of Dingzhou since he was young. His riding skills came from the Hu people and he is known as the best in the army." This was not the first time Fan Xian had heard of Gong Dian's background. He looked calmly at the rebel army's camp and found that most of the people around the crown prince were generals of the Qin family. It seemed that only Gong Dian had appeared in the Dingzhou Yi family. Gong Dian was the previous deputy commander of the Imperial Army and Minister of Guards. He had once been a trusted subordinate of the Qing Emperor. However, because of the Qing Emperor's suspicions toward the Yi family, he chose to use the Hanging Temple matter and chose a groundless reason to throw Gong Dian into prison. Fan Xian had been involved in the Hanging Temple matter from beginning to end and had been heavily injured once. There were many secrets inside that he still did not understand. However, he knew that because of the Emperor's paranoia, he had no idea how much terrifying opposition he had brought to Jingdou. Fan Xian's heart jumped again. The eldest princess, Chen Pingping, and Lin Ruofu had both said on different occasions that the Emperor did not have any major weaknesses. It was only because of his paranoia that he could be defeated. The great prince suddenly raised his head and said, "It's a draw." Fan Xian nodded. He knew what the great prince meant by a draw. The rebel army had surrounded the palace. Given the palace's defensive power, it would not be able to hold out for more than a few days. Thus, they had to use the most direct method at the very beginning to strike at the rebel army's morale. Although they did not have the extravagant hope that they would be able to take the flag and steal their morale, they could at least make it so that they would not be able to charge in one go and create a relatively slow process. That was why there was the wretched killing in front of Xingyang Gate and the first use of the city-guarding crossbows in half a century. Even if it was only aimed at one person, it had to make the rebel army's hearts tremble. However, Gong Dian's confident capture of the flag caused this momentum to turn back. Fortunately, although the rebel army was once again full of vigor, looking at the other party's formation, they should not attack immediately. The rebel army had a clear advantage. Why didn't they attack immediately? Fan Xian could calculate a few points. The royal palace had a natural advantage in defense. The city walls were tall and thick, and the crossbows were united. The power in the palace was already at a dead end. If the rebel army attacked, this kind of destructive power that would rise from a dead end forced the crown prince to reconsider. The more important question was, who would attack? Although the heavenly soldiers and generals I've been hoping for have yet to arrive, Fan Xian said to the great prince with a warm smile. I think the rebel army actually has a headache. They are not a monolithic bloc. Nominally, the Yi and Qin families both support the crown prince, but what does the crown prince think? Yi Zhong is the second prince's father-in-law. He raised his hand and pointed to a military horse far to the right and said, "The second prince and Yi Zhong should be over there. Do you think the crown prince is willing to let the Qin family charge, and break through the enemy lines and let the second prince take advantage? The great prince said calmly, "Of course, the second prince is also unwilling to let his father-in-law go out. He has many things on his mind. If the last bit of capital is used up, presumably, he knows very well how Chengqian will deal with him in the future." Exactly. Fan Xian gently patted the green brick wall of the royal palace and looked at the rebel army camp slowly moving toward the royal palace. In a quiet voice he said, "Our two brothers both have ulterior motives. If we don't discuss it, we won't fight. Of course, no matter how you look at it, they are lions and we are antelopes. They don't want to lose too many people, so they will certainly urge us to surrender," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. "The Crown Prince is a gentle person. The Crown Prince was fighting in the name of righteousness. He was not here to rebel. If he didn't say a few dignified words and just fought like this, wouldn't he be preparing to receive guests before the memorial archway was properly opened?" Fan Xian was certain that this was something the rebels would never do, so he quietly waited for the Crown Prince, Li Chengqian, to speak. Tens of thousands of rebel soldiers had already gathered. Forming into a formation, they slowly pressed toward the royal palace. The black mass was like a dark cloud pressing down on the city, making one's heart palpitate. The black cloud-like rebel soldiers stopped 2 arrows away from the royal palace. Among the sea of people, a number of people slowly rode out from the rebel army camp. It was the Crown Prince and the important generals beside him. Beside the Crown Prince were the generals of the Qin family. Gong Dian, who had shown his confident hand earlier, was 2 riders away. Fan Xian watched this scene with narrowed eyes and saw much of the content clearly. Gong Dian following the Crown Prince was certainly an expression of the Yi family's loyalty. However, the Crown Prince did not have much trust in the Yi family. To the Crown Prince's right was the old Qin master. This old man had once again donned his armor for battle and put on the armor he hadn't worn for a long time. His old face was filled with a murderous aura accumulated on the battlefield for countless years. His usually muddy eyes stared at the juniors on the royal palace like an eagle. There was no sign of age. Given the old Qin master's position and authority in the Qin palace, he was, without question, the core leader of the rebel army. The Empress Dowager trusted him, and the Crown Prince also trusted him. He had also given the Empress Dowager and the Crown Prince sufficient support. However, a few strands of white hair seeped out from the armor. Blown by the Jingdo morning wind, he appeared somewhat lonely. Fan Xian's eyesight was very good. He looked silently at the elder of the Qin military. For some reason, he thought of when he watched the 1998 World Cup in his previous life. After the semi-final between Brazil and Holland, Zagallo had walked against the wind by the side of the field. His few strands of white hair had been blown into a miserable state. He was not letting his mind wander. He was just unconsciously remembering that scene. Fan Xian took a deep breath and thought to himself, Zagallo's meritorious service for generations. After winning that battle, he still ended up with a miserable ending. How could the old Qin master be an exception? The old Qin master, who was being cursed by Fan Xian, glanced at the Crown Prince and slowly opened his mouth to speak to the imperial soldiers on the palace walls. "You are soldiers of the Qin kingdom. How dare you help Fan Xian, a regicide? Prince Heqing, listen to my orders." The moment the old Qin master opened his mouth, the air in the square above the royal palace began to buzz. Fan Xian's pupils constricted. He and the great prince met each other's eyes. They both saw the fear in each other's eyes. The old Qin master had a powerful cultivation and profound martial power. Fan Xian quietly wiped the sweat from his palms on the brick. He had long guessed who the true warrior of the Qin family was. No matter what, he had never thought that the 9th level hidden deep in the Qin family would be the old Qin master himself. That old and weak man was actually a superior 9th level super warrior. This reality immediately charged into Fan Xian's heart and made his expression become ugly. He was indeed worthy of his great reputation. The Qin family had dominated the world for decades. The old Qin master had always sat in the position of the foremost person in the Qin military. Even the incomparably arrogant Yan Xiaoi was incomparably respectful to him. There was indeed a reason for this. Fan Xian's right index finger began to tremble slightly, not out of fear, but out of excitement. In the beginning, it had been very difficult to snipe Yan Xiaoi. Now that he had sniped this old man, presumably, his sense of accomplishment would be even stronger. When he glanced at Gong Dian, who was silently following in the rebel army's camp, his right index finger once again recovered its calm. He shouted toward the foot of the palace walls, "Qin Yi." The old Qin master had not finished his first sentence when Fan Xian had already shouted out these two words. These two words were mixed with his tyrannical zhenqi. Although it was not as thick and grand as the old Qin master's voice, it was particularly violent. It immediately suppressed the old Qin master's voice. The tens of thousands of people on and below the palace walls all turned their gazes toward Fan Xian on the palace walls. The old Qin master furrowed his brows slightly. It seemed that he had not expected the tyrannical zhenqi in Fan Xian's body to be this powerful. He had also not expected to hear the name he had not heard in a long time below the palace walls. Qin Yi? In this world, other than the Empress Dowager, who else dared to call him this? Fan Xian dared. The faces of the Qin family generals beside the crown prince all revealed angry expressions. "Qin Yi!" Fan Xian once again shouted explosively. It rose up in spirals and spread throughout the royal palace, shocking everyone's hearts. It also gathered the old Qin master's attention. Separated by a great distance and under the gazes of tens of thousands of people, Fan Xian looked at where the old Qin master was and faintly said, "You only have one son. Where is he?" Qin Heng had entered through Xingyang Gate and was the closest. The rebel army had already surrounded him, but he still had not arrived. The rebel army generals had long been secretly worried about this matter. Hearing Fan Xian's words, they couldn't help but feel their hearts jump. The old Qin master's eyes narrowed, but he did not have an overly shocked expression. After pausing for a moment, Fan Xian opened his mouth and said in a cold voice, "You should have guessed something yourself." "Correct, your eldest son was killed by my subordinate Jinggu with a spear in the camp. Today, Qin Heng was killed by the Overwatch Council at Xingyang Gate. If you dare to betray the Emperor, I can have your Qin family end without descendants." What malicious words! What a thorn that pierced straight into one's heart! In an instant, the battlefield once again sank into a suffocating silence. The great prince glanced at him and said in a low voice, "It doesn't seem to be a good choice for you to make the old man mad right now." Fan Xian's gaze was level as he stared at where Crown Prince Li Chengqian was. Faintly, he said, "I just want to see if there will be any more problems between the old man and the Crown Prince when he is mad." The development of the situation did not continue according to Fan Xian's plan. After the old Qin master heard Fan Xian's malicious words, he only slowly lowered his head and then slowly raised it again. His old face wrapped in armor was completely indifferent. There was not a trace of change in emotion. "Fan Xian, let me thank you first for helping me resolve a question I've had for many years," the old Qin master said slowly. Old Master Qin said slowly, his voice spreading in all directions. "My eldest son was killed in the camp. That murderer should have died in prison. Later, when I checked the files, it was the same. But I never found the murderer's body. Now I know that it was taken away by that old black dog." The military elder slowly said, "I will leave your body intact. As for Chen Pingping, I will have him suffer 1,000 cuts. As for Qin Heng, I have always had confidence in this child. Even if you could stop him for a moment at Xingyang Gate, how could you do anything to him?" The old Qin master said coldly, "Even if he dies, so what? It is hard for a general to not die in battle. If he dies to your schemes, then he dies honorably. Die without descendants? I haven't even been afraid of that demoness of yours. Do you think you can anger this old man with just a few words? Old Master Qin looked at the younger generation on top of the city wall with a mocking gaze and said word by word. The old man has already gone mad. Let's see how long he can pretend for. When one is old and about to die, this kind of nonsense is especially abundant. Just like the old Qin master, Fan Xian finally learned of a secret he had guessed for a long time. He sighed in his heart and turned his gaze slightly. Looking sincerely at the crown prince beside the old Qin master, he spoke before the crown prince could open his mouth, and with sincerity. Chengqian, surrender. Sincerely saying, everyone, please give me your monthly tickets. Chapter 565. Chengqian, just surrender. Fan Xian's warm and gentle words made the tens of thousands of people inside and outside the royal palace dumbfounded at the same time. They felt it was incomparably absurd. The rebel army had surrounded the city. The people in the palace couldn't escape even if they wanted to. Sir Fan Jr. was shamelessly speaking on top of the palace walls at this moment to urge them to surrender. Crown Prince Li Chengqian, dressed in martial attire, sat on his horse. He sucked in a cold breath and thought to himself that Enji's skin was indeed becoming thicker and thicker to be able to say such things. Furthermore, he had said it so naturally. If someone who didn't know the situation had heard this, they would probably think that he, Li Chengqian, was the pitiful person being chased like a rabbit and not Fan Xian. In just one night, Fan Xian had changed from a court criminal to a so-called regent. He had shaken off his life of exile and broken into the royal palace. He had almost captured the crown prince in one move and successfully reversed the situation. Immediately after, in the early hours of the morning, the crown prince had luckily escaped. The army entered the city and instead surrounded Fan Xian in the palace. The so-called changing of the royal flag on top of the palace walls probably referred to the story of what had happened that night. The story had always been absurd. What was the point of Fan Xian saying such absurd words? Li Chengqian raised his head to look at his two brothers on top of the palace walls. After smiling bitterly, he shook his head and thought self-mockingly that after the old Qin master had spoken, he should have been the one to sincerely urge his brother to surrender. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had rushed to say such words and stuffed his own words in his mouth. Fan Xian was indeed sinister to the extreme. The sound of messy horse hooves rang out from the square to the right. Li Chengqian unconsciously turned his head to look and saw the Dingzhou army entering the capital from the west gate, slowly moving toward the center of the army he was in. He furrowed his brows. In front of the thousands of people, he saw the second prince's handsome face. A faint chill rose in his heart. The things in his brother's heart were not simple. His face was very similar to Fan Xian's. The calculations in his heart were probably just as sinister. The Dingzhou army slowly stopped on the right flank of the rebel army and carefully maintained a respectful attitude toward the rebel camp. "Big brother, you and I." Crown Prince Li Chengqian glanced at the second prince and finally opened his mouth. He could not wait for the second prince to speak. However, he did not have the support of internal qi. He had to shout to be heard by those on the palace walls. Although he still maintained the dignified royal aura that he had cultivated as the crown prince of the Eastern Palace for a dozen years, in comparison, it was not as valiant as when Fan Xian had berated the Qin family. Fan Xian picked his ear and glanced at the great prince. He didn't say anything because the great prince was listening very seriously. The crown prince's words were all within his calculations. He was trying to use brotherly affection to convince the great prince. At the same time, he was still pushing the Dong Mountain incident onto Fan Xian. Although the Crown Prince knew that the Great Prince would not believe that Fan Xian was the assassin, he still had to say it. Any brotherly bond had to be built on a logical foundation. The Great Prince's expression darkened. The Emperor had 5 sons. If one did not count Fan Xian, who had grown up in Danzhou, and the 3rd prince, who was the last to be born, then he, the Crown Prince, and the 2nd prince could be said to have grown up together. Although the Crown Prince's status was respected, the 3 brothers had a good relationship, particularly before the Emperor showed favor to the 2nd prince. The interactions between the 3 princes were more valuable than the bloody plots and stories in the history book. Everyone had thought, but no one wanted to imagine, that one day these 3 brothers, who had grown up together, would meet with swords and weapons. The 2nd prince, who had remained silent since the rebel army surrounded the palace, also opened his mouth. He gently used the heel of his boot to tap the horse beneath him and allowed the horse to take him 10 feet out of the rebel army ranks. Gazing at the palace walls, he followed the Crown Prince's words and began to speak sincerely to the Great Prince. It had to be said that the 2nd prince did indeed have a way of winning people's hearts. He did not mention the matter of the Great Prince surrendering. He only used the friendship of the past to describe his displeasure at the Great Prince helping Fan Xian in an angry tone. He also faintly mentioned that the Qing Emperor's attitude toward the Great Prince was not like that of a father toward his son. Fan Xian glanced at the Great Prince and found that beside him, the Great Prince's expression was growing darker and darker. He was not worried that the Great Prince would fall under the pressure of the situation and the Crown Prince and 2nd Prince's familial attacks. When he analyzed something, he would always start from a person's personality. He knew that the Great Prince's personality was like a raging fire. He turned to look at the still shouting 2nd Prince, and furrowed his brows slightly. He recognized the general beside the 2nd Prince as Yi Zhong. 30 years ago, Yi Zhong was already the commander of the Jingdou garrison. Now, he was in his 50s, but he did not look old at all. Furthermore, he did not have the imposing aura of other famous Qing generals. His figure was a little short and a little fat. However, Fan Xian would not underestimate him because he knew that he was a 9th-level ace who had long made a name for himself. Yi Liuyun's closest nephew, who had once fought with his terrifying mother, was not a simple person. Furthermore, a person who could become the commander of the Jingdou garrison at the age of 20 could not be described as simple. Fan Xian's brows furrowed deeper and deeper, but his eyes grew brighter and brighter. They were as bright as a star that refused to retreat under the light of the rising sun. The Great Prince suddenly yelled loudly at the rebel soldiers below the palace walls, "Enough!" The 2nd Prince smiled helplessly and stopped talking. The Great Prince said in a severe voice, "What time is this? You still don't forget to frame Fan Xian. I know that for the sake of the throne, you are willing to do any ugly things, but don't forget, there are some things that I cannot do. If you want to attack, then attack. Don't be so long-winded like a woman." These words were said resolutely and with great vigor. They did not give the Crown Prince and 2nd Prince any room to maneuver. The 2nd Prince's usually gentle face finally became dark. For some reason, he had become so angry. Angrily, he roared toward the palace walls, "Big brother? Don't forget, we are the brothers." Brothers? The Great Prince had been worried about the guards of the royal palace and the major plan with Fan Xian for many days. His mind had been exhausted. His eyes were deeply sunk in, but they only made his gaze appear even sharper. He looked at the Crown Prince and then at the 2nd Prince. Suddenly, in a severe voice, he said, "Brothers. You aren't even willing to be sons, yet you are willing to be brothers." There was a silence. These words had exposed too many things. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls had long known of this matter from the posthumous edict. Immediately, their eyes revealed grief, anger, and pain. However, the expressions of the rebel soldiers below the palace walls became strange. Although the emperor had been assassinated on Dong Mountain, the emperor's might still existed. As a disciple of the Qing army, he carried the crown prince's banner. In reality, what he was doing was killing the emperor and usurping the throne. Who would not be terrified? Who would not have their stomachs drumming? The great prince stood between the battlements of the palace walls and furrowed his brows deeply. Looking at the crown prince, he said sorrowfully, "The Dong Mountain incident was done by the eldest princess. I know you don't have this ability, but you must know. Even if father wants to depose you, you are still a son. How could you do such a thing that is worse than an animal?" The crown prince's expression was dim. He maintained his silence and allowed the great prince to angrily rebuke him. The old Qin master furrowed his brows and waved his hand. The rebel soldiers behind him began to prepare to attack the palace. Gradually, the sound of bowstrings being pulled rang out from behind them. The teeth-numbing sound of bowstrings being pulled rang out. As the three princes fiercely discussed the dark secrets of the royal family and were angry with each other, no one noticed that Fan Xian had already left the top of the palace walls by himself. Following the long stone steps down into the royal palace, he walked across the spacious square and headed toward Taiji Palace. Along the way, Fan Xian watched intently. He found that although the great prince was skilled in field battles on the grasslands, he was also very skilled in the defense of the palace. Preparations had been made everywhere. Beside the entrance of the stone steps, he had even taken down 2 corner towers of the royal palace and prepared stone and heavy wood. It looked like he was preparing to attack the palace later. At the side of the 3 palace gates below the imperial city, there were already some grotesquely shaped stones that even had moss on them. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and wondered if the fake mountains in the palace had also been taken down by the eldest prince. Just as he was thinking this, a group came in front of him. Under the escort of a few imperial soldiers, 100 or so tired-looking eunuchs were using carts to push the moss-covered stones. It was indeed the fake mountains in the palace. There were 3 palace doors in the royal palace. Usually, only one would be open. When the rebel soldiers attacked, they would not only choose one. Fan Xian knew that the great prince was preparing to use the fake mountains and stones to firmly block these 3 palace doors. This work had probably been prepared since before dawn. Blocking the rebel soldiers outside the palace and trapping himself inside the palace was what was called defending to the death. Fan Xian sighed. He knew that the eldest prince had already made up his mind to die. Compared to the spacious royal palace, there were not many imperial soldiers. Compared to the spacious royal palace, they were sparse. There was not much confidence. Fan Xian sighed again. He knew that the 1,000-odd imperial soldiers had already been moved to the palace square where the eunuchs and serving girls lived. First, it was to suppress the restless factor in the palace. Second, it was because, in the entire royal palace, that was the easiest place to break through. Entering Taiji Palace, he saw the worried officials, the heavy-faced Lady Ning and Yi Guipin, and the restless third prince. Fan Xian sighed 3 times in his heart. He bowed to the scholars Hu and Shu, but he piled a smile on his face and said to the third prince, "Qingping, the battle is about to start. Do you feel excited?" The third prince, Li Qingping, was, after all, a child. After learning that the royal palace was surrounded, he had begun to feel afraid. Although he forcefully suppressed it on his face, after hearing Fan Xian's words, he couldn't resist flattening his mouth. Amidst the fear, there was still a smile from Fan Xian's teasing. It appeared very comical. Fan Xian turned and bowed to the pale-faced Empress Dowager. He then glanced at the long-haired Empress and said in a low voice, "I invite the Empress Dowager and Empress Dowager to come up to the palace walls to watch the battle." Since ancient times, rebellion had to be carried out. The work of clarifying righteousness and flaunting one's legitimacy had already ended amidst the great prince's angry rebuke and the crown prince and second prince's depression. The rebel soldiers at the foot of the palace walls were already closing in, particularly the thousands of archers in the rear barracks. They had begun to prepare to shoot in unison. There were only 1,000 imperial soldiers on the top of the palace walls. After this rain of arrows, there would probably be many casualties. The great prince's hand pressed against his sword and walked silently on the top of the palace walls. Occasionally, he gave a few orders, ordering the soldiers to prepare to welcome the rebel army's attack. This was the first time the Qing royal palace had been baptized by a rain of arrows. No one knew what kind of bloody rain and foul wind they could withstand after the rain of arrows. Because they had not planned to defend the royal palace and did not control the city guards, the imperial soldiers' defense was already at a disadvantage. They did not have enough bows and arrows in their hands. They could only rely on the 4 city-guarding crossbows at the 4 corners of the palace walls. However, there were tens of thousands of rebel soldiers. Even if these 4 crossbows were cannons used to kill mosquitoes, how many could they kill? Get ready! The great prince's hand gripped his sword tightly as he stared at the black mass of rebel soldiers below the palace walls. Hearing the endless sounds of bowstrings being pulled taut, his heart involuntarily tightened. Thousands of archers drew their bows at the same time. The heart-shaking creaking sound seemed to pierce through everyone's eardrums on the palace walls and shake through everyone's mind. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls had already hidden behind the arrow mound. Soldiers holding shields were also waiting behind the great prince. A great battle was about to break out at any moment. Everyone was waiting for the moment the sky full of arrows whistled through the air. However, Fan Xian did not let all of this happen. He had no interest in admiring the sight of the siege. He also did not show off until the imperial soldiers had suffered heavy losses and then bring out his good or bad hand. A flurry of hurried footsteps came from the stone steps. Following the footsteps was Fan Xian and the dozens of panting old officials behind him. There were also a number of women half supported and half held by eunuchs. These women were originally the most honorable women in the world. Now they had become the most lowly and humiliating. Fan Xian held the 3rd prince's hand with one hand and walked behind the great prince. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the rebel army camp below the palace walls that was about to shoot. He couldn't help but feel shocked. With so many arrows shooting over, how could the royal palace be defended? He circulated his jinqi and shouted loudly to the rebel soldiers below the palace walls, "Chengqian, 2nd prince, quickly stop." Hearing this, the crown prince and 2nd prince raised their heads and looked toward the palace walls. They then saw a scene that made their hearts tremble. Mother! Mother! Empress Dowager! Looking at the women who had suddenly appeared on the palace walls, the crown prince and 2nd prince couldn't help but cry out in surprise. Even the old Qin master and Yizhong couldn't help but furrow their brows. Then, they heard Fan Xian yell at them from beside the women, "Don't fight in a hurry. I've brought your mother, grandmother, and brother to see you." Hearing these words, many people had the urge to vomit blood. No one would have thought that Fan Xian, who was renowned as an immortal poet and had displayed his dark power as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, would say such shameless words. However, only Fan Xian knew that after experiencing the life and death experience on the meadow, his life had finally undergone a welcome change. He had shaken off the dark air accumulated from 2 lives and was gradually coming closer. Gradually, he was going to merge with the little boy on the rooftop in Danzhou who had yelled for it to rain to collect his clothes. Such a Fan Xian was a cute Fan Xian, a disgusting Fan Xian, a shameless Fan Xian, and a terrifying Fan Xian. No matter how shrewd the crown prince and 2nd prince were, seeing this frightening scene, they couldn't help but become angry. The 2nd prince scolded in a stern voice, "Fan Xian, you're shameless." Fan Xian glared back at him and scolded, "You just realized?" The crown prince was also incomparably angry, but he immediately said to the old Qin master beside him in a panic, "Don't shoot. The old Qin master furrowed his brows and thought that it was natural for these nobles in the palace to be used by Fan Xian to threaten him. Had the crown prince not thought of this? The old general sighed in his heart. The crown prince was kind, but the cowardice that had gradually disappeared these 2 years had finally surfaced. For a soldier, in this moment of life and death, there should be no hesitation. The so-called fear of shooting at the rat for fear of harming the innocent was just cowardice. In the end, the old Qin master did not understand that sometimes, another name for cowardice was human nature. Without question, Fan Xian's behavior right now did not have much of a human nature. He had only calculated the crown prince's personality. Calmly smiling, he stood by the great prince's side and said, "I just don't want to be shot into a porcupine. Why did you bring Qingping here? He is still a child." The great prince sighed and looked at the officials beside him, the Empress Dowager and Lady Shu. He then glanced at the third prince and spoke with disapproval. "As the future monarch of Qin Kingdom, I must see this scene with my own eyes." Fan Xian gently held the third prince's trembling hands. The third prince had seen so many rebel soldiers with his own eyes. He had truly been frightened. Fan Xian smiled slightly at the trusted aide beside him and ordered, "Please have Lady Shu stand in the left corner tower. Please have the Empress stand in the right corner tower. Please." He glanced at the pale-faced but silent Empress Dowager and said, "Please have the Empress Dowager stand by my side. I'll put 3 master cards here. I want to see if their arrows are as accurate." Hearing these words, the people on the palace walls all felt a chill in their hearts. After the clamor, Fan Xian looked at the people in the rebel army camp who were arguing fiercely about something and said, "Regardless of what the crown prince and the old Qin master decide to compromise in the end, presumably they will both be very displeased with each other." The great prince sucked in a cold breath and looked at him. "You even calculated this?" Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at the cold-faced second prince and the short tower like Yizhong beside him. "There are still many things I am calculating. If the one leading today was the second prince, the rain of arrows would probably have arrived by now. Although the Empress is not as amiable as Lady Shu, her fate is much better than Lady Shu's because her son is stronger than Lady Shu's son. Even if they don't shoot, the rebel army will still attack." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. "Go and prepare. I need to think through a problem." The great prince glanced at him and ordered his trusted aide to heavily protect the third prince. He then glanced at the silent Empress Dowager. Confusion grew in his heart, but it was not convenient for him to say more. He left. Fan Xian let go of the third prince's hand and held the Empress Dowager's old and slightly stiff hand. He took a few steps to the left like a filial grandson holding his grandmother. He allowed the Empress Dowager, dressed in a bright yellow phoenix robe, to appear on top of the palace walls. She was like a bright lamp hanging high in the morning sky, reflected in the eyes of all the rebel soldiers. The archers of the rebel army unconsciously loosened their bowstrings. Although the orders from their superiors had not yet come, their arms were already beginning to ache. Furthermore, everyone had guessed who the old woman in phoenix robe was. She was the emperor's mother, the crown prince's grandmother, and the only remaining elder of the Qing royal family. Even talking about such a noble figure was a blasphemy, much less pointing an arrow at her. If they accidentally injured the Empress Dowager, who would bear the consequences? As long as it was a Qing citizen, no one wanted the Empress Dowager to suffer any harm. Thus, when Fan Xian brought the Empress Dowager onto the palace walls, the great prince's mood was awkward. After the scholars Shu and who did not listen to their advice, they could only sigh. Those who knew the details of the palace rebellion last night all knew that Fan Xian never used the most sinister methods to deal with the noblest of people. The sword mark on the Empress Dowager's neck was the most powerful evidence. Fan Xian gently helped the Empress Dowager tidy the high collar of her phoenix robe and carefully pulled out a strand of hair. Evenly, he said, as expected, Empress Dowager still has to wear formal attire. Only then will it have sufficient intimidation power. It was not in vain that I wasted my time ordering those old nannies to dress you up. The Empress Dowager suddenly turned her head. Boundless hatred abruptly appeared in her old and tired eyes. It was as if she wanted to swallow Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't even look at her gaze. By her ear, he quietly said, I also know that it is very painful not being able to speak. Taking my medicine is also very painful. Think about it, your Li family deserves this kind of retribution. I am punishing you on behalf of my mother. We have our own club on the front page of the website, the Qingyu Year Cat Fan. If everyone is interested, you can go in and take a look. There are many interesting comments and tidbits. I personally liked the chapter today. If you also liked it, please give me a monthly reward. There are too many strong books this month. The pressure of getting a reward is too great. P.S. I have some personal matters to take care of in the next 2 days, so I will write less. I sincerely wish everyone a happy weekend. Chapter 566. It was sweet and sour. It was the taste of the pill Fan Xian had forced the Empress Dowager to swallow. The pill had always been kept close to Fan Xian's body. Even though he had experienced so many life and death battles these 2 years, entered the sea and climbed mountains, and was covered in wounds, Fan Xian did not lose these pills. He knew these pills were very important to him. It had been a dozen years ago in Danzhou when Fan Xian's teacher, Fei Jie, had solemnly stuffed the medicinal pouch into his small hands. He was afraid that the tyrannical Jinqi Fan Xian practiced would explode and cause him to die a tragic death. However, in these dozen years, Fan Xian had never taken this medicine. After killing Xie by the second prince's side in the Jingdo government and fighting the shadow head-on, his Jinqi finally exploded in his body, and he became a cripple. Even under these circumstances, he did not take the medicine. He knew how tyrannical this medicine was. It was a medicine that scattered martial art. Fan Xian was unwilling to disperse all the cultivation in his body, so he endured the pain of his meridians being torn and the stiffness of being unable to move. He persisted in not taking the medicine Sir Fei Jie had left behind. Fortunately, Haitang had later secretly brought the heart of Tianyi Dao to Jiangnan. Only then could his strange injuries slowly heal. Now, he had finally delivered this pill into the Empress Dowager's mouth. The medicinal properties of this pill were strong. It followed the path of scattering martial arts and gathering qi. It entered one's internal organs with unusual directness and gradually annihilated the body's vitality. It had to be said that if Fan Xian did not have the heart of Tianyi Dao, once his Jinqi exploded, he could only use this pill to disperse the overly violent tyrannical Jinqi and exuberant vitality in his body. However, the Empress Dowager was already old and weak. She did not have many years left to live. Taking this pill at this time was equivalent to the remnants of life in her body being gradually pulled out of her body by the medicine, speeding up the path of death. Her life gradually dimmed. Her old body could not withstand it and was already at its weakest point. Fan Xian had a great fear, so he did not brazenly use poison on the Empress Dowager. However, the medicine Fei Jie had left behind was not poison. No matter which famous doctor in the world came to diagnose, they would not be able to find anything strange. The Empress Dowager no longer had the strength to speak. Soon, she felt the burden on her body grow heavier and heavier. Even if she wanted to raise her arm, she couldn't do it. Unless another great grandmaster appeared in the world and forcefully used extremely pure Jinqi to help her reflect for an instant, the Empress Dowager could only miserably become a cripple who couldn't speak or move. Then, she would slowly wait for death to come. It was not that Fan Xian was ruthless. It was not that Fan Xian's desire for revenge had burned away his rationality like wildfire. In the current situation and with Fan Xian's great hidden worry, he could only use this method to ensure his present and future safety. Right now, the rebel army was surrounding the city. The Empress Dowager could be the God's card to weaken the rebel army's attack. But what about the safety in the future? The Empress Dowager did not know how sinister and vicious the medicine she had taken contained. She only thought it was a mute medicine. She still looked at Fan Xian with hatred. Fan Xian did not meet the Empress Dowager's dim and angry gaze. Instead, he turned his cold gaze toward the two powers high above the palace walls. He looked seriously at Yi Zhong beside the second prince and the short and strong general. A strange light shone through his eyes. It was as if he was thinking endlessly about something. The Dingzhou army had not entered the capital to present prisoners of war. As usual, there were only a few thousand soldiers. However, Yi Zhong and the second prince had led tens of thousands of people into Jingdou. It looked like they had long been prepared. However, he did not find Hongqing's figure among the rebel army. This made Fan Xian feel a glimmer of relief. Looking from a distance, the rebel army leaders seemed to be arguing about something. The crown prince remained silent. He used his worried eyes to watch the movements on the palace walls. He was worried about his mother and grandmother's safety. In his heart, he cursed Fan Xian, the great prince, Hu Shu, and the other old officials viciously. Fan Xian suddenly narrowed his eyes. He saw that the rebel army leaders had stopped their discussion. The sound of horse hooves gradually rang out. The Qin and Yi families each split up their troops and pressed toward the two flanks. He abruptly turned his head and glanced at the great prince not far away. The great prince nodded at him to indicate that he had long been prepared. Only then did he relax. It looked like the main direction of the rebel army's attack, other than the main gate of the royal palace, had chosen Taiping Square. The palace walls there were slightly shorter. Furthermore, it was a place where eunuchs and serving girls lived, so the entrance was never strictly guarded. The great prince had long predicted this. He had moved a large number of soldiers forward to guard it. He had also moved over 70 to 80% of the loyal generals he had raised from the Western Expedition Army. It was just petty cleverness. It was only to stall for time. He still hadn't caught the one that had escaped and could change the situation. Fan Xian's mind suddenly began to empty again. His eyes gazed at the densely packed rebel army below the palace walls. It was as if he had seen through their existence. He gazed at a place further away, at the past, and at the variable he had been waiting for but had never appeared. 30,000 against a few thousand. No matter how high the palace walls were, even if the rebel army didn't dare to release arrows, and even if they had to use people to fill in the gaps, they had to fill in the moat outside the royal palace. They had to fill in a human ladder, climb to a high place, and destroy everything in the royal palace. Looking at the busy arrangements of the rebel army and the gradually rising siege ladders, Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. He felt a glimmer of coldness at the bottom of his heart. The three-part ladder produced by the third workshop of the palace treasury had finally been moved over. The attack was finally about to begin. These military equipment were all produced by the palace treasury. As the head of the palace treasury, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a glimmer of absurdity. The things he had produced were going to be used to attack him, and he couldn't find any way to deal with it. His heart began to beat faster. His scalp felt numb. His brows were furrowed tightly. Suddenly, he took a few heavy breaths. He felt that there was a problem with his breathing. His chest felt heavy. Leaning against the arrow hole made of bricks, he slowly crouched down. The hearts of everyone on the palace walls jumped. They all rushed in his direction. The battle was imminent. If one of the main commanders, Fan Xian, suddenly had a problem with his body, it would, without a doubt, be a massive blow to the morale of the imperial army. The third prince was close to him. Fearfully holding his left arm, he called out, "Sir, what is it?" Without waiting for more people to gather around him, Fan Xian raised his right arm with his head down. In a tired voice, he said, "I need a quiet place to think about some problems. You all go prepare. Don't mind me." Hearing this, no one could relax. Seeing his stubbornness and the fact that the rebel army was already preparing to attack, they could only accept their orders and rush to the area they were defending. The great prince stood in the commander's position and glanced at him from a distance. Seeing Fan Xian, who had been full of killing intent earlier, now crouching helplessly at the foot of the palace walls, he couldn't help but feel his heart dim. "Who the scholar? I'll have to trouble you to buy some time." Fan Xian lowered his head and spoke in a quiet voice. Who the scholar glanced at him with concern and sighed. He walked to the side of the palace walls and spoke in a loud voice. The third prince anxiously stood guard by his side. He didn't know how Fan Xian was right now. Fan Xian simply sat down on the foot of the palace walls and buried his head deeply between his legs. Breathing with difficulty, he looked very pitiful. He was like a homeless cat on a rainy night. Faintly, who the scholar's righteous and awe-inspiring words reached his ears. It seemed that he was carrying out his final conversation with the crown prince. Although these words floated into Fan Xian's ears, he was not able to hear a single word clearly. However, he had confidence in Hu the scholar. Since he was buying time, he had to buy it for a while. The problem Fan Xian faced was the chaos in his mind. After returning to the capital from Dong Mountain, he had done things step by step. In his confrontation with the eldest princess, there had been victories and defeat. Even when he was trapped in the royal palace, he was still full of confidence. The details of many events gave him a faint hint. The eldest princess and crown prince's rebellion had long been calculated by Chen Pingping. Since it was so, when things progressed to the final moment, there would always be a chance to turn the tables. Just as he had thought in the early hours of the morning, there would always be someone coming to save him on colorful auspicious clouds. However, the morning clouds had already dispersed, and the red light was no longer there. Where was the person who would come to save him? A heavy sniper rifle? No, if he hadn't thought through this matter clearly, Fan Xian would not use this trump card. There was a problem. Fan Xian closed his eyes tightly. As he coughed, he quickly turned his head. In the end, he still could not grasp the important point that had flashed through his mind like a goose. He had used up too much of his mind and energy. Fan Xian's coughing grew more and more severe. He slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were completely blood-red. After being injured by Yan Xiaoi, forcing his way into the capital, forcefully breaking into the palace, and laughing and talking without fear on the royal palace, he had already used up all of his energy. He was only relying on the Third Bureau's secret ephedra pills to forcefully stimulate his mind. Fan Xian took a few heavy breaths. Using trembling hands, he took out 2 pungent ephedra pills from his clothes and brought them to his lips. He carelessly chewed a few times and swallowed them. He knew that this medicine was very damaging to the body. In such a dangerous situation, even if he had to drink doves to quench his thirst, he could only gladly endure it. Although Li Qingping didn't know what his teacher was eating, he, who had been concerned about him the entire time, had already guessed that Fan Xian's body had reached the end of its life. His blood-red eyes represented an inauspicious omen. Involuntarily, he nervously and unhappily gripped Fan Xian's hands on his knees. The medicine took effect quickly. Fan Xian's chest felt much more comfortable. It was as if each breath he took in was many times more air than usual. Naturally, his coughing also slowed. However, the lines of blood in his eyes grew denser. Compared to his slightly haggard but full of heroic spirit, he appeared to have a heart-palpitating charm. With a slap, Fan Xian, who was sitting on the ground, suddenly pulled his hand out of Li Qingping's small hands. Like lightning, He reached to the left and grabbed the old woman's feet in the golden palace shoes. Fan Xian didn't turn his head to look. He only coldly said, "You didn't dare to kill yourself in the palace. Now, you want to use your death to provoke the crown prince into a fierce attack?" When he stretched out his hand like lightning, the pair of feet in the palace shoes were trying to quietly stand on their tiptoes and move their owner's weak body toward the hard ground below the palace walls. Li Chengping looked at this scene with great terror. He watched as the Empress Dowager's feet were forcefully pressed down by Fan Xian the moment before she jumped off the wall to kill herself. The Empress Dowager had taken the medicine and was already at the end of her life. Fan Xian had not recovered from his heavy injuries. Forcefully increasing his power, he was also almost at the end of his life. However, a murderous aura of death still echoed between these two grandmother and grandson, who were both at the end of their lives. It was always simple for a person to die. The Empress Dowager looked coldly and hatefully at the side of Fan Xian's face. Seeing the strange redness seeping out of his eyes, she gradually felt pleasure in her heart. No matter how powerful the wicked woman and her son were, in the end, they could not be allowed to exist in this world. This was something that had long been decided by fate. History had long proven this point. However, after Fan Xian said those words, he unexpectedly sank into silence. His eyes stared blankly ahead and gradually furrowed his brows. His eyes gradually lit up, just like when he was looking at Yizhong earlier. It was as if he had finally thought through something and made up his mind about something. The negotiations between the scholar and the crown prince had already broken down. The rebel army beat the war drums and began their first attack on the city. Far behind them, in the area of Taiping Square to the left, a heaven-shaking cry of killing rang out. The war drums rang out. Although there was no rain of arrows, there were stray arrows flying through the sky with a whistling sound. Countless rebel soldiers pushed ladders and large carriages covered in oilcloth. Bravely, they braved the giant crossbows and sporadic rain of arrows. Against the rocks falling from the top of the palace walls, they charged forward. In an instant, the foot of the palace walls was filled with wretched cries. The sight of blood flowing and the pain of fire burning filled the air. The morning sun had long risen into the slanting sky. Mercilessly, it watched Jingdo bleed again after a dozen years. Fan Xian slowly rose and emotionlessly watched the scene in front of him. He didn't look at the Empress Dowager beside him. Instead, he said to her, "I've thought through many things." When he pressed down on the Empress Dowager's foot, he couldn't help but think of his grandmother in Danzhou. He thought of the words she had always sternly told him, "The Fan family does not need to take sides because we will always stand on the Emperor's side." Chapter 567. The stray arrows whistled through the sky, but it was more of a deterrent. Under the Crown Prince's powerful suppression, the rebel army did not have the courage to rain down a terrifying rain of arrows on the city walls. Thus, the pressure the Imperial army guarding the royal palace faced immediately lessened. They only had to face the problem of contact. Although the sounds of killing shook the heavens below the royal palace, it did not cause any losses to the Imperial army. Instead, it was the Imperial army stationed in the direction of Taiping Square that faced the greatest danger. However, there were many rebel soldiers at the main gate of the royal palace. At this moment, the thousands of rebel soldiers below the city walls had split into 3 rows and formed 3 black lines that pressed forward. It was truly frightening. Muffled sounds continuously rang out from the 4 corner towers of the imperial city. Every sound would tug at the heartstrings of the crowd, and the entire imperial city would tremble. The strong vibrations represented the strength of the city-guarding crossbow. The giant crossbow bolts pierced through the air like black light and mercilessly stabbed into the rebel army's formation. Countless bursts of blood blossomed, and the ground was covered in sticky meat paste. However, there were only 4 city-guarding crossbows, and there were only 2 on the left and right side of the square. How many people could they kill? The rebel army's triple wave charged quickly to the foot of the royal palace without any obstruction. The main target of the city guarding crossbows was still the military equipment the rebel army used to attack the city, especially the sharp and heavy carriages used to break through the thick palace gates. These carriages had fire blades made from cowhide, and the front end was a giant piece of wood that had been sharpened into a sharp point. They were already very heavy. Once they were pushed at high speed, the impact against the palace gates was very powerful. A crossbow bolt accurately struck a battering ram. The sharp tip easily tore through the seemingly tough cowhide and slammed heavily into the ram. Although the ram was tough and could not be broken by a giant crossbow bolt, the powerful impact of the city guarding crossbow still caused the ram to jump up. It was like a beetle on the ground that felt the earth shake. Then, it rolled over miserably and crushed a number of rebel soldiers beside it to death. It could no longer move. Within the 3 rows of rebel army charging formation were a dozen heavy and murderous rams. The moment the attack began, the 2 city guarding crossbows fired with all their might and successfully destroyed 3 of the rams. However, the city guarding crossbows took too long to reload, and the rebel army's charge came very quickly. In an instant, most of the rams had passed the line of fire of the city guarding crossbows and neared the 3 main gates of the royal palace. The rebel soldiers shouted in unison, pushing the battering ram as they charged forward with all their might. With a number of teeth-numbing sounds, the rams finally successfully crashed into the thick palace gate. The main gates of the Qing royal palace were very thick. Under such a terrifying crash, they still shook violently. The hinges of the door creaked as if they were about to fall apart. The 4 giant door bolts, which were arranged from top to bottom, were bent out of shape. However, the thick door latch finally withstood this powerful impact, and the creaking sound of the door hinge gradually calmed down. Other than a large dent in the main door of the imperial palace and a dozen or so copper nails falling, everything else was fine. At least, in this attack, the main gates of the Qing royal palace still appeared sturdy and unbreakable. However, the rebel soldiers did not have a trace of a strange expression. Under the stern yells of their superiors, they quickly pulled the first wave of rams away from the palace gates. The rams in the second wave had already passed through the sparse arrows of the imperial soldiers on the city walls. They had escaped the powerful city guarding crossbows that, like old people, only moved once in a while, and crashed viciously into the palace gates. There was another loud crash. This time, the palace gates had finally received an irreparable damage. The entire gate began to tremble. It gave one a feeling that it was on the verge of collapse. It was as if it could collapse at any moment. The elites of the imperial army who were on standby behind the palace gates led their horses and watched this scene calmly. Although their faces were calm, the anxiety that flashed across their eyes revealed their true feelings. Separated by a thick door, the rebel soldiers risking their lives to launch a powerful attack saw hope that the royal palace would be broken. Their morale immediately rose. With a loud roar, they charged forward again. The 3rd wave of attacking troops arrived. Under the merciless attacks of the imperial army's arrows, boulders and logs, the rebel army left behind hundreds of corpses. Finally, they succeeded in withstanding the 3rd wave of attacks on the palace gate. With a muffled crack, dust flew into the air. It was like a paper bag filled with smoke had been smashed open by a naughty child's naughty palms. The dust settled slightly, and the field of view became slightly more peaceful. The countless rebel soldiers in the square saw that the thick and heavy palace gates in the middle of the royal palace had been smashed open. They couldn't help but cheer in unison. However, the group of elites closest to the imperial city didn't even have time to release any cheers. Even the excitement and joy on their faces were immediately replaced by shock and anger. They could clearly see that even though a large hole had been smashed open in the palace gate, revealing the thick wooden stubble inside, the entire palace gate showed no signs of collapsing. The ground was covered in golden copper nails. Behind the hole was a thick layer of stone and dirt. There was not a single gap to be seen. The people in the royal palace had blocked the palace gate. Did they not think of leaving a way out for themselves? At this moment, what was the difference between the royal palace and a large tomb? A rebel army officer roared wildly and led the attacking soldiers beside him into the hole. Although there wasn't much space, even if they had to dig open this palace gate. Military orders were like mountains. The Qing soldiers were never cowards who feared death on the battlefield. A long black spear pierced out like lightning from the only gap above the stone and dirt. It pierced the officer's throat, and fresh blood sprayed out. Below the royal palace, 10 paces behind the piles of fake mountains and broken stones in the long palace gates, 300 imperial soldiers calmly and nervously watched for any movement in the palace gates. Their commander had already led a small group in. At this moment they had the advantage of the terrain. There was no reason for the rebel soldiers to attack so easily. Above the royal palace, the great prince watched coldly as the rebel soldiers' attacks grew stronger and stronger. He raised his right arm and brought it down viciously. The soldiers at his side accepted the order and quickly waved the yellow flag in their hands. Along the line in front of the royal palace, the hundreds of imperial soldiers on the palace walls moved at the same time. They lifted the sack at their feet and carefully tore it open. They then scattered it toward the heads of the rebel soldiers, who were no longer within the range of the crossbows. The slightly yellow powder was like dirty snow as it scattered down. In an instant it enveloped the thousands of rebel soldiers closest to the royal palace. The rebel general paled in shock. He thought it was poison from the Overwatch Council and ordered his subordinates to be careful. It was not poison powder. The third bureau was not Fan Xian's tofu shop. They did not have the ability to produce so much poison. This yellow powder was all crude gunpowder that Fan Xian had ordered taken from the bottom floor of the square building before the imperial soldiers entered the palace in the early hours of the morning. The royal palace had never made preparations to welcome a powerful military attack, so there was no hot oil or anything that could be burned. If it were not for the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, standing on their side, the battle to defend the city would probably have progressed unusually miserably. The great prince glanced at Fan Xian, who had been calmly watching the rebel army camp in the distance, and gently nodded his head. Fire! The face of the trusted officer who had been following the great prince was full of ruthlessness. He gave the order in a loud voice to all of the imperial soldiers on the royal palace walls. The previously sparse rain of arrows on the royal palace walls suddenly exploded with the most concentrated rain of arrows since the start of the battle. Furthermore, these arrows all carried a red light. It was like the inauspicious color that Qin Heng's valiant general saw before he died under Xingyang Gate. The fire arrows arrived below the walls in an instant. They did not need to be precise. They only needed to shoot into the powder. The sky was beautiful. The autumn sun had risen, and the weather was gradually warming up. The morning wind had already left. The powder that had been scattered down was not blown away by the wind, nor was it blown back up the walls as Fan Xian had been worried about. Instead, it formed a large patch of fog that enveloped the thousands of rebel soldiers below the walls. Looking at the beautiful morning scenery of the willow trees by the river bank, one could only see the vague figures inside that were beginning to panic. The fire arrows entered the fog. In an instant they began to burn at a terrifying speed. Countless flames burned vigorously and quickly connected to form a large sea of fire. It was like a fire dragon lying below the royal palace. It was also like a calm lake illuminated by the golden sun. Gradually, waves began to rise and churn. It was extremely bright and scorching hot. It actually covered the light of the sun in the sky. What about the people in the fog? They howled wretchedly and burned, turning into countless pitiful people on fire. They desperately tried to run out of the fog. However, how could such a large area of burning be endured by normal creatures? Countless people on fire ran wildly on the square. Their wretched cries rose into the sky. The scene appeared unusually terrifying. Not a single burning rebel soldier was able to run back to their camp. Most of them had become charred corpses below the palace walls. Some of the burning people on fire only had time to run to the square before falling to the ground with a splat. With the remaining flames and rising smoke on their bodies, they twitched endlessly. Such a scene was extremely tragic. The rebel army camp in front of the buildings in the distance was in a state of panic. Even the Qing army, famed for its strict military discipline, felt fear at this moment. No one had thought that the imperial soldiers guarding the city would have such a terrifying method. The crown prince's face was ashen while the old Qin master looked coldly at the palace walls. Slowly, he said, only Fan Xian could do such a ruthless method. The smell of burning in the square stimulated everyone's state of mind. Even the imperial soldiers on the palace walls felt a glimmer of fear and helplessness. Looking at the terrifying scene below, some people's lips turned white. They wondered if those charred corpses had all been killed by them. After such a destructive attack, the first wave of rebel soldiers who entered the palace returned dispiritedly. However, there were not many people who returned. The royal palace was finally held by a hair's breadth. However, the rebel army did not carry out a second round of attack. It was clear that regardless of whether it was the defenders or the attackers, they had all been shocked by this unusually bloody and terrifying fog of fire. They all needed some time to digest and stabilize their morale. However, the instigator of this terrifying fire attack, Fan Xian's expression was unusually calm. He looked at the rebel army camp in the distance and pressed his lips together without saying a word. The great prince saw that Fan Xian's right hand, which was hanging by his sleeve, was trembling slightly. The veins in his eyes were becoming denser and denser. The great prince had not thought that the Overwatch Council's gunpowder powder would have such a terrifying effect. Looking at the scene in front of him, he, who had long experienced the blood and fire of the battlefields of the western region, did not feel any emotions that he should not have. However, he still felt shocked. If this powder could be used like this, what kind of changes would occur in future battles? Today is luck. Fan Xian did not turn his head to look at him. Quietly, he said, "There is no wind or rain today. That is why there is such a good effect." Then, he slowly lowered his head. Ever since he had taken control of the palace treasury, he had always been very attentive to the joint research work of the Third Workshop and the Third Bureau. In the depths of his heart, he understood why his mother, Yi Qingmei, had put so much effort into other military equipment and people's lives but had strictly forbidden the use of gunpowder in this world. Even when he had saved Xiao En in Shangjing, the Overwatch Council had only provided 1 cart of gunpowder. The use of gunpowder in this world was still very clumsy. It was even worse than the self-made firecrackers in his previous life. In this world, only Fan Xian knew that even wood shavings flying through the air could cause a large explosion, much less gunpowder powder. Fan Xian couldn't help but worry whether the scene today would open Pandora's box for this land. After a moment, he immediately felt relieved. The palace treasury's steel craftsmanship was not up to standard. There was no need to worry about the arrival of the era of firearms. Furthermore, just as he had said to the great prince, the main reason why the fire protecting the city had such a large effect was because the heavens were on their side. His luck was as strong as before. As for the wretched scene in front of him, Fan Xian actually felt his heart palpitate. Since he was young, he had seen countless corpses and had personally killed countless people. But, when he personally saw so many charred corpses appear in front of him, he still felt waves of the urge to vomit. This was a battlefield, a true battlefield. It was precisely because of this that Fan Xian was even more determined to win. If a person came to this world with some kind of mission, he believed that his mission was the agreement with Haitang. If he wanted to reach that agreement, he had to survive today. Using a knife to kill was still killing. Using a gun to kill was still killing. Using gunpowder to burn people to death was also killing. Other than being a bit more terrifying and ugly, there was not much difference. After all, the rebellion this time belonged to a civil war. The two sides fighting were the elite troops of the Qing kingdom. The scene just now made too many people feel a chill in their hearts. The rebel soldiers returned to their camps to lick their wounds, preparing to once again carry the resentment of revenge and begin an even more powerful attack. The expressions on the faces of the imperial soldiers on the city walls were complicated. Many of them didn't even dare to look at the black-clothed Sir Fan Jr. standing coldly on the city walls. The smell of burning and the remnants of fire were still burning in front of the royal palace. The vermilion palace walls and the green bricks on top of the walls were all burned with streaks of color. It looked like this beautiful and solemn royal palace had been ruthlessly slashed with countless scars by a knife. The great prince looked at the scene in front of him and slowly swept his gaze over the imperial soldiers on the city walls. In a steady and firm voice, he said to all sides, "This is war. Remember, those below the walls are rebels. If we allow them to break into the royal palace, the Qing court will descend into darkness. The people will never have a chance to rise again. You will all be crushed to pieces." "What is below the walls?" "It's the enemy," the great prince shouted in a stern voice. "You are all soldiers who have followed me back from the west. Why have we worked so hard to fight the Hu people on the grasslands? Everything is for the Qing kingdom. Those enemies want to destroy the foundation of the Qing kingdom. They are no different from the barbaric Hu people. They are just beasts. I order you, from this moment on, you must treat these rebel soldiers as Hu people. Everything is for the Qing kingdom. The emperor is watching you from above." These were not hot-blooded words, but coming from the commander's mouth, they had a surprising effect of comforting people's hearts. The eyes of the imperial soldiers on the city walls gradually lit up, no longer as dim and lost as they had been earlier. "For the Qing kingdom!" Everyone on the palace walls cried out. Even the third prince, who was standing by Fan Xian's side, was no exception. Only the Empress Dowager, who had been firmly restrained by Fan Xian, had a glimmer of mockery and panic flash through her eyes. A wave of heavy footsteps rang out on the city walls. A group of eunuchs, under the watch of Overwatch Council officials, carried 3 black coffins with difficulty to the top of the city walls. The coffins landed heavily on the city walls and made a few muffled thuds. Everyone looked at the 3 coffins in astonishment. Fan Xian gently held the third prince's hand and stood behind the great prince. To the imperial soldiers, officials, and Overwatch Council subordinates around him, he quietly said, "We are the emperor's officials. We have received the emperor's posthumous edict to stop those rebellious plots. Regardless of whether we succeed or fail, we will not retreat a single step." The great prince's expression was solemn. He continued Fan Xian's words and said, "There are 3 coffins here. Qingping, Anji, and I will each have one. If the royal palace is broken into, the 3 of us will die here. This can be considered filial piety to father and loyalty to the Qing kingdom." He glanced at everyone and then slowly said, "Defend the palace to the death. Does everyone have confidence?" Even the cliched method of carrying coffins to battle had been brought out by Fan Xian. How could the soldiers not feel their blood boil? In unison, they cried out, "Yes!" Fan Xian held Li Qingping's hand and said in an even voice, "Are you afraid?" The third prince thought for a bit and shook his head forcefully. "No. Father's son will not be afraid." "All right." Fan Xian glanced at him with a slight smile and didn't say anything more. He only thought that if the change did not happen and the royal palace was actually broken, he could only take the third prince and flee to the ends of the world. He could only hope that this kid wouldn't scold him when the time came. In the distance, the rebel soldiers began to gather again. The morale that had been suppressed by Fan Xian's evil plan seemed to have successfully turned into resentment toward the royal palace. Most of the Qin kingdom's troops had been on the battlefield for a long time. Their ability to mobilize soldiers was not inferior to anyone else's. The gazes of the rebel soldiers toward the royal palace began to fill with naked murderous intent. The sea of fire appeared terrifying, but in reality, it did not cause much damage to the rebel soldiers. Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him and couldn't help his heart tremble slightly. He thought to himself that if he had calculated wrong, the following steps would probably kill many people on his side. He knew that he was completely unfamiliar with military affairs, so from beginning to end, he had not made any suggestions about the great prince's arrangement of troops. Instead, he calmly acted as a spectator and helper. At this moment, he was going to make an unusually daring suggestion. "How many Imperial soldiers do we have left?" 2,700. Basically, we haven't lost much. Fan Xian tilted his head and listened as the sounds of fighting in Taiping Square grew quieter. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Do you think we can hold it?" The great prince's sword-like brows were smeared with a layer of murderous intent. "Straightforwardly," he said, "even if Father personally led troops, we wouldn't be able to hold it." A glimmer of self-mockery suddenly flashed through the corners of his lip. "The disparity between us and the enemy is too great. If the Western Expedition Army had not been disbanded by Father, if I led, no, even if I only led 1/3 of the Western Expedition Army, I would still dare to fight a decisive battle against the rebel soldiers below." The great prince took a deep breath. "However, don't worry. Even if we lose, we won't lose so badly. The generals and soldiers under my command have all eaten Hu people's meat and drank Hu people's blood on the grasslands. The Qin family, it has been 20 years since the old man personally led troop. The soldiers of the Jingdou garrison are extremely lazy. The only one is the Dingzhou army." Fan Xian cut him off and said, "In that round of attack and defense just now, I noticed a problem." "What problem?" Fan Xian moved closer to the great prince's ear and quietly said a few words. "What are you thinking about?" A cold light flashed through the great prince's eyes. "I'm thinking about gambling." Fan Xian lowered his head and faintly said, "We no longer have any trump cards in our hands. If we continue like this, we will eventually die." The great prince furrowed his brows and said, "War is not child's play. What you're saying is too absurd." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "It is indeed absurd. However, I truly can't think of any opportunity to turn the tables." He turned his head and glanced at the 3 coffins glowing with black light. His gaze gradually became determined. He still had a trump card, but he had not seen everyone's trump card clearly. No matter what, he would not use it. The great prince was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "How do you want to gamble?" "Dig up the rocks at the palace gate." Fan Xian raised his face and looked through the slightly warm air of the square at the commander of the Dingzhou army, Yi Zhong, who was quietly saying something to the second prince. His gaze narrowed slightly. "We should be prepared to charge out at any moment and give ourselves a chance." He then smiled warmly and said, "Give the world a surprise." Coincidentally, Yi Zhong, who was in the middle of a secret discussion with the second prince, seemed to feel the gaze from the palace walls. He raised his head and glanced back with unusual calmness and coldness. Ahem, when the great prince said "This is war," I almost couldn't resist writing that all is fair in war. Everyone should know that I am the worst at writing these things. When I first conceived of Qin Yu's year, I made a great wish that I would try to learn and improve my abilities in this area. I am still not very good, but please see my progress and hard work. P.S. I don't know who wrote the KFC's Qin Yu's year review in the book review section. I just thought it was very funny. I don't know if that book friend knows me in real life, but most of his spoilers are definitely wrong. I was mad and changed the wrong words 3 times. It is now 6:08. To the friends who subscribed earlier, I apologize. Recently, there have been too many wrong words. No matter how mad I am, this is the 4th time I've changed the wrong word. I've actually changed them before, but there are still so many. This is 6:09. Sorry. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.